Daniel's wedding ring cut into the center of my palm while my mother promised his estate to my sister. I was standing in the side hallway of the funeral home 6 days after my husband died. The air smelled of lilies, furniture polish, and coffee that had burned down to a bitter crust. Through the thin door beside me, my mother lowered her voice and said, "Soon you'll have his $1 million for your wedding." My sister, Paige, did not ask why Daniel's money would belong to her. She asked, "Will it clear before the ballroom payment is due?" My father answered before Mom could. "Once Natalie signs the company acknowledgement, the estate pays us. She'll sign if she thinks it protects Daniel's name." The ring pressed deeper into my skin. I did not open the door. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I stepped backward, looked at the clock above the coat rack, and fixed the time in my memory. Before I tell you how my parents tried to turn my husband's death into my sister's wedding fund, tell me how you are doing today. Stay with me, and please subscribe to the channel so you can follow what happened when I finally stopped protecting the people who had never protected me. At 11:43 that morning, my mother had promised away an estate that had not even entered probate. That detail mattered later. At the time, all I knew was that Daniel was gone. My parents were planning something behind a closed door, and I still had to walk back into a room full of people who expected me to thank them for coming. I released my fist slowly. Daniel's ring had left a pale circle inside my palm. I slipped it onto the chain around my neck, tucked it beneath my black dress, and returned to the viewing room. My father was waiting beside the closed casket. Martin Whitaker had built a construction company from one truck and a rented garage. At 66, he still carried himself like every room belonged to him. Even at my husband's funeral, he wore the same expression he used in business meetings, patient on the surface and irritated underneath whenever someone delayed him. He touched my elbow and guided me toward a quiet corner. "Natalie, we need one small signature before people start leaving." He held out a packet with a blue cover sheet. The title read, "Routine Company Property Acknowledgement." Daniel had worked for Whitaker Construction. The laptop, phone, and project files he used belonged to the company. So the title did not immediately seem strange. What did seem strange was my father bringing it to me beside Daniel's casket. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. "It's housekeeping. Daniel left us with a mess, and payroll is due Friday." My mother joined us, her hand settling between my shoulder blades as if she were supporting me. "Your father is trying to spare you the details," Elaine said. "There are questions about some vendors Daniel approved. Signing this lets the company handle them quietly." I opened the packet. My father's jaw tightened. He had expected grief to make me obedient. The first page concerned company devices and records. The second referred to unauthorized vendors. Halfway down the third page, a paragraph stated that I acknowledged Daniel had exercised personal control over certain vendor accounts and that his estate would cooperate in resolving resulting liabilities. I closed the packet. "This is not a property acknowledgement. It is standard language," Dad said. "Then your attorney can send it to mine." "You don't have an attorney for this." A woman behind him said, "She does now." Marisol Vega stepped between us without raising her voice. She was 52, silver threaded through her dark hair, and she had the kind of calm that made louder people seem foolish. Daniel had hired her for estate planning 2 years earlier. I knew her name, but until that week, I had met her only once. She held out her hand. My father did not give her the packet. Marisol looked at me instead. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did you initial any page?" "No." Only then did she turn back to him. "Mr. Whitaker, I need a copy of every document your company has presented to Natalie since Daniel's accident." Dad's face hardened. "This is a family matter. It became an estate matter when you asked his widow to admit liability at his funeral." My mother drew herself upright. "No one is admitting anything. We are trying to protect Daniel's reputation." Marisol waited. Silence had always made my mother uncomfortable. She filled it by saying too much. "There may have been irregularities," Mom continued. "If we resolve them privately, no one needs to hear ugly accusations." I heard again what Dad had said behind the door. "She'll sign if she thinks it protects Daniel's name." I looked at Marisol. "Take the packet." Dad finally handed it over, but he kept his fingers on the cover for a moment. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," he told me. "No," I said. I'm making sure I understand what you want me to sign. That was the first boundary I set after Daniel died. It would not be the last. Marisol placed the packet in a document sleeve and wrote the time, location, and my father's name across a label. She treated 3 pages of paper like evidence. My parents noticed. So did Paige. She approached us with her phone in one hand and a folded tissue in the other. At 31, my sister had perfected the appearance of fragility. Her mascara remained flawless while everyone around her worked to keep her comfortable. She wrapped her arms around me. "I hate that you're dealing with business today," she whispered. Her phone vibrated against my back. When she pulled away, the screen lit with a notification from a wedding planning app. Final ballroom balance due January 26. Paige turned the phone face down. "I thought you were postponing," I said. Her eyes widened as though I had accused her of celebrating Daniel's death. "We haven't decided anything." Grant came over from the guest book. He looked exhausted and uneasy in a dark suit that did not fit across his shoulders. "I told Paige we could move the date," he said. "No one would blame us." Paige's mouth tightened. "Daniel would want us to keep living," she said. "He loved family." Daniel had liked Grant. He had tolerated Paige. He had never once said that his death should finance their wedding. I looked at the app again before the screen went dark. I memorized the venue name and due date. "Do what you think you can live with," I said. Paige stared at me, searching for an accusation she could fight. I gave her none. That unsettled her more. Marisol asked to speak with me privately. We went into a small office used by the funeral director. The room had no windows. A brass lamp cast a yellow circle over the desk. "Daniel signed a will in 2023, she said. "It names you as the primary beneficiary and nominated executor. Does that mean I can stop whatever my parents are doing?" "Not yet. The court has not appointed you. Until probate is opened and you receive letters testamentary, you should not sign on behalf of the estate." I rubbed the chain at my neck. Did Daniel know they would do this? He knew there was a dispute coming at the company. What kind of dispute? Marisol chose her words carefully. He gave me a report and several working copies of records. He also left original documents and original media in a sealed steel box. A steel box? He instructed me to preserve it if Whitaker Construction tried to make him responsible for a vendor called Northline. The name meant nothing to me. What is Northline? I don't know enough yet to answer that honestly. It was not the answer I wanted, but it was the first honest answer anyone had given me all day. Why didn't Daniel tell me? I can't speak for him. I can tell you he did not believe he was going to die. That hurt more than the possibility that he had prepared for death. Daniel had made plans for a fight he expected to survive. Marisol told me she had come because Daniel had asked her to be present if anyone from the company approached me before probate opened. He had not predicted the funeral packet. He had simply known my father would move quickly if he felt threatened. "I need you to do 3 things, she said. Do not confront them about Northline. Do not hand over any of Daniel's personal records. Call me before you sign anything connected to the company. I already heard enough to confront them." "What exactly did you hear?" I repeated every word from the hallway, including the time. Marisol wrote it down. "Good," she said. "Memory changes under stress. Record facts while they are fresh." That instruction gave me something solid to hold. By the time I left the funeral home, dusk had turned the windows into dark mirrors. My parents had gone to their house with Paige and Grant. They had not invited me. I was relieved. The drive home took 30 minutes. I remember the turn signal clicking too loudly and the empty passenger seat beside me. Daniel used to rest one hand on my knee at red lights. I kept expecting the weight of it. Our house was exactly as we had left it the morning of the accident. His running shoes sat beside the stairs. A mug with a hairline crack waited near the sink. His jacket hung over the back of a chair because I had complained for 10 years that he never used the hook. I set my purse down and opened the plastic bag the hospital had returned with Daniel's belongings. His wallet was there, his keys were there, his personal phone was there. His company laptop and company phone were not. A receipt had been folded beneath his watch. Whitaker Construction had reclaimed both devices through my father. The form carried Martin's signature, but the serial number lines were blank, and the time of transfer had not been recorded. The devices belonged to the company. Taking them back was not automatically wrong. Taking them without a complete inventory while state safety investigators were still preserving records was something else. I photographed the receipt from both sides. Then I changed the passwords on our personal email, cloud storage, banking, and home security accounts. I revoked every shared login I could find. Only after that did I listen to Daniel's voicemails. There were 4 from the week before the accident. The first was about dinner. The second reminded me to call the plumber. The third was just Daniel laughing because he had seen a dog riding in the passenger seat of a convertible. The fourth had been left 23 minutes before the collapse. His voice was low and hurried. "Nat, I'm heading back into the riverfront site. The crew should not be in that section, but Martin pushed the schedule again. If he tells you I took money, don't argue with him. Ask Marisol about Northline. Follow the delivery, not the invoice." I stopped breathing for a moment, then forced the air back into my lungs. Daniel continued. "I sent Marisol the report. Do not sign an admission for the company, even if they say it will protect me. I'll explain tonight." There was a pause, and the sound of a truck reversing somewhere behind him. "I love you. I'm sorry I kept this from you." The message ended. He had expected to come home that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood. Grief came hard, but it did not erase what he had asked me to do. I let myself cry until my vision cleared. Then I forwarded the voicemail to Marisol, saved 2 copies, and wrote down the date and time. Next, I opened a blank document. At the top, I typed timeline. The first entry was the accident. The second was the hospital. The third was the missing devices. The fourth was the packet. Then I wrote the sentence that turned my grief into a case I could understand. They promised away his estate before I had buried him. I called Marisol and told her to prepare the probate petition as soon as the courthouse opened. The next morning, she called before 8. "I finished reviewing the funeral packet," she said. "Natalie, there is a clause your father did not explain." I tightened my hand around Daniel's ring. "What does it say?" "It says that by signing, you would acknowledge Daniel controlled Northline." My parents had not brought me routine paperwork at my husband's funeral. They had brought me the first draft of his confession. Marisol filed Daniel's will with the Davidson County Probate Court on October 2nd, 8 days after the funeral. 4 days later, the court issued the papers naming me executor of his estate. Until then, I had been Daniel's widow. After that order, I was also the person legally responsible for protecting everything he had left behind, paying valid debts, challenging false ones, and making sure no one took advantage of the silence his death had created. Marisol explained it across the conference table in her office. "The letters testamentary give you authority," she said. "They do not give you permission to move money wherever you want. You preserve the assets until we know what is legitimately owed. I'm not planning to spend anything. I know, but your family may describe caution as greed. You need to understand the difference before they start." Daniel's estate was substantial, but it was not a vault containing $1 million in cash. It included his investment account, his share of a small rental property, proceeds from a cabin he had inherited and sold, and money Whitaker Construction owed him under a written agreement to repurchase his minority interest. After the mortgage balance on the rental property, final medical charges, funeral expenses, and ordinary administration costs, Marisol estimated the net estate would be close to $1 million. The workers' compensation carrier had opened a separate death benefit file because Daniel had died at work. Marisol made it clear that those benefits were not part of the probate estate and could not be claimed by Whitaker Construction as repayment for anything Daniel had allegedly done. I set aside an estate reserve for legal fees, accounting costs, and expert review. I did not take out loans. I did not sell Daniel's investments in a panic. I did not distribute anything to myself. My mother still told relatives I was locking up the family money. The first time an aunt repeated that phrase to me, I asked one question. "Whose family money?" She did not call again. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing official arrived from Whitaker Construction. My father did not apologize for the funeral packet. My mother sent messages asking whether I was eating, sleeping, and remembering that stress could make people suspicious. Paige sent pictures of flowers. She framed each one as a request for my opinion. White roses or ivory ranunculus? Tall arrangements or low ones? Did the ballroom look too dark in winter? I answered none of them. On October 20th, a courier delivered the creditor claim. Whitaker Construction claimed Daniel's estate owed the company $892,000. The number was printed in bold at the top of the first page. The company alleged that Daniel had created an unauthorized supplier called Northline Industrial, approved inflated invoices, received personal payments through a consulting account, and caused project delays and contract losses when the materials he purchased failed inspection. They were accusing my dead husband of stealing from the company and then demanding that his estate pay for the damage. 3 exhibits were attached. The first was a vendor summary listing Northline as a supplier Daniel had personally recommended. The second was a group of invoices with his electronic approval. The third was a calculation of losses that included replacement materials, penalties, legal expenses, and expected damage to the riverfront contract. Marisol read every page twice before she spoke. This does not mean they receive the money, but it stops me from closing the estate. It can delay distribution while we contest it. They still have to prove the debt. They know that. Yes. I looked at the amount again. They don't expect to win in court. Marisol leaned back slightly. What do you think they expect? They expect me to get tired. That afternoon, my father called and asked me to come to the family house without Marisol. I refused. He said lawyers made families cruel. I told him lawyers had not brought a confession to Daniel's funeral. The meeting took place 2 days later in Marisol's office. Dad arrived with the company's attorney. Mom sat beside him in a navy dress and held a folder on her lap. Paige and Grant took the chairs nearest the door. Grant looked at me once, then lowered his eyes. My father began as though he were presenting a reasonable business solution. The company has no desire to drag Daniel's name through a public hearing, he said. We are prepared to reduce the claim. To what? Marisol asked. $650,000. My mother gave me a sorrowful look. That would leave you with something, she said. More than enough to begin again. Begin what again? Your life. I watched her hands. Her nails were newly done in the pale pink shade Paige had chosen for the wedding. Dad continued. Daniel made mistakes under pressure. If this goes further, the insurance companies and state investigators will see every transaction. We can settle privately and describe it as a business disagreement. You accused him of stealing. We used the language required to preserve the company's rights. Marisol turned to the company attorney. Are you threatening criminal referral if the estate refuses to settle? The attorney shifted in his chair. No one is threatening anyone. Paige spoke before he could continue. Can we please stop talking like strangers? If Natalie signs, everyone can move on before the wedding. Grant looked at her. Paige, he said quietly. What? This has been hanging over all of us. Daniel had been dead for 34 days. My sister was tired of his death interfering with her plans. Dad placed a proposed settlement on the table. If you sign this week, the company reduces the claim and avoids any public accusation of deliberate theft. Payroll continues. The projects continue. Hundreds of employees keep their jobs. There it was. Not a threat against me, a threat wrapped around people who had nothing to do with the fraud. I thought of the crews Daniel used to talk about over dinner. Men and women who worked in freezing rain and summer heat. Apprentices who needed their health insurance. Parents who could not afford to miss a paycheck. My father knew exactly which part of me he was pressing. I slid the document toward Marisol. I'm not discussing a settlement until she reads every line. Dad's patience cracked. You always need someone else to tell you what to think. No, I need someone qualified to tell me what you hid in the language. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. My parents left together. Paige followed them, but Grant stayed behind long enough to look at me. I didn't know the claim was that high, he said. I could not tell whether he was ashamed or calculating how much would remain for Paige. Ask her where she thought the wedding money was coming from. His face tightened. Then he left without answering. Marisol spent the next hour reviewing the settlement. The most dangerous sentence appeared on page 9. As executor, I would acknowledge that Daniel had exercised exclusive control over Northline's vendor account, its approvals, and all related transfers. Exclusive control. If I signed, my parents would gain more than $650,000. They would gain a statement from Daniel's legal representative saying he alone controlled the transactions. They could hand that sentence to the state safety investigators. They could give it to the company's insurer. They could use my signature to separate Martin, Elaine, and Paige from everything done through Northline. The settlement was not simply a way to take the estate. It was a way to make me help frame Daniel. I understand why they offered to reduce the amount, I said. They are buying an admission, Marisol replied. With his own money. Yes. She asked whether I wanted to reject the proposal immediately. I did, but I made myself slow down. I want to understand every allegation before we answer. That evening, I created a 4-column table. The first column listed each fact the company claimed. The second listed the source they cited. The third listed what the source actually proved. The fourth listed what was missing. Northline created by Daniel. Source, vendor summary. Missing, application, tax record, account creator, approval history. Daniel received money. Source. Transfer to Daniel Ross Consulting. Missing. Account. Opening documents, withdrawals, actual beneficiary, Daniel approved invoices. Source. Electronic approval image. Missing, device, login session, upload history, original timestamp. I worked until after midnight. Organizing the accusations did not lessen my grief, but it stopped the accusations from becoming one shapeless mass. Each claim had edges. Each edge could be tested. The first break came from an invoice included in Whitaker Construction's own filing. The company said Daniel had approved it on the afternoon of September 18th. At the bottom of the exhibit was an upload timestamp, 2:14 in the afternoon. At 2:14, Daniel had been in emergency surgery. I knew because the surgeon had come to the waiting room at 2:27 and told me they were still trying to control the internal bleeding. I called Marisol before sunrise. The invoice was uploaded while Daniel was unconscious. She asked me to read the timestamp twice. Then she said, "Do not say he could not have approved it yet. He was in surgery. The upload time may not be the signature time. Someone could claim he approved it earlier and another employee uploaded it later." The correction frustrated me, but she was right. I had found a contradiction, not a conclusion. By 9 that morning, Marisol had sent formal preservation demands to Whitaker Construction, Northline's vendor portal, the company's outside information technology provider, and the bank connected to the consulting account. The demands required them to preserve login histories, device identifiers, email headers, version records, server backups, access logs. No one was yet being ordered to give us everything. But once they received notice, destroying or altering the records would create another problem for them. My parents reacted before the information technology provider did. Mom left a voicemail saying she could not believe I was treating the family like criminals. Dad emailed me a list of employees whose jobs he said were endangered by my refusal. Paige posted a photograph of herself and Grant outside the ballroom. Beneath it, she wrote that family funds would clear soon and that after a painful season, their celebration was finally moving forward. She deleted the phrase family funds within an hour. I had already saved it. The shared wedding planning app also showed that the final ballroom balance was due within days of the proposed settlement deadline. The timing did not prove the estate was intended to pay the bill. It did prove Paige expected a financial event connected to the family to occur before the wedding deadline. I added both items to my table and labeled them context, not proof. That distinction became important. I was beginning to understand that a convincing lie often contained many facts. My parents were counting on me confusing facts with the story they had built around them. 3 days later, Marisol called while I was at work. The outside information technology provider responded to the preservation demand. I closed my office door. What did they find? Preliminary account activity under Daniel's user credentials. From before the accident? Some of it. I waited. Marisol's next words came slowly. His account was active 2 hours after the hospital recorded his death. My fingers tightened around the phone. Someone used his password? We do not know that yet. It could be a stored session, delegated access, an automated process, or a person using his credentials. Do not attach a name to it. What did the account do? The provider can confirm it opened the safety report file. A second document arrived while we were speaking. I heard Marisol's keyboard stop. What is it? I asked. The preliminary log shows a status change. From what to what? She was silent for a moment, reading the line again. From rejected to approved. My father had claimed Daniel approved the dangerous materials before the accident. Someone had changed the record after he was dead. The first person who officially told me Daniel's records had been altered was not Marisol or the private examiner. It was a Tennessee OSHA investigator named Owen Mercer. He met us in a government office on the last Monday of October. The room was narrow, with beige walls, a metal filing cabinet, and a window overlooking a parking garage. Mercer placed a digital recorder between us and explained that he was still gathering facts. He could not share witness statements, internal conclusions, or the full investigative file with me. I understand, I said. What I wanted to say was that my husband had died at a site my father controlled, and everyone seemed to have more access to the truth than I did. Instead, I handed him a copy of Daniel's final voicemail and the stop work notice Marisol had received before the accident. Mercer read the notice carefully. It identified the Riverfront Warehouse Project, the Eastern Support Line, and a group of structural connectors whose certification Daniel had been unable to verify. At the bottom was Daniel's instruction that no work continue in the affected area until the material records were confirmed. "This copy came to your office before the collapse?" Mercer asked Marisol. "Daniel emailed it to me at 8:17 that morning," she said. "The original email, headers, and attachment have been preserved." Mercer made a note. "The company's version is different." I sat straighter. "Different how?" "The records initially provided to us show the area as approved for limited work." "Approved by Daniel?" "The file contains his electronic approval. That was added after he died." Mercer's expression did not change. "We have received notice of account activity after his death. Our technical team is coordinating with the appropriate agencies." I wanted him to say he believed me. Instead, he did what competent investigators were supposed to do. He separated what we suspected from what he could prove. "Did my father give you the approval file?" I asked. Whitaker Construction provided the required safety records after reporting the fatality. The company had reported Daniel's death within hours, just as the law required. They had not hidden the collapse or pretended it happened elsewhere. They had done something more calculated. They had given investigators a version of the truth prepared to survive an initial review. Mercer asked me when Daniel first mentioned Northline. I told him about the voicemail, the funeral packet, and the creditor claim. I did not tell him what I believed Page had done. At that point, belief was still ahead of evidence. When the interview ended, Mercer accepted the voicemail through a formal evidence transfer. Marisol kept our original copy and documented the handoff. In the hallway, I asked her whether Tosha would stop the creditor claim. "No," she said. "The safety investigation and probate dispute are separate. So my family can accuse Daniel of causing the accident while the agency is still deciding what happened? They can make the accusation. They still have to support it." Every answer seemed to end with the same requirement: proof. 2 days later, Marisol arranged a meeting with one of the workers Daniel had pulled out of the collapse zone. His name was Luis Mendoza. He was 26 and had worked for Whitaker Construction for 3 years. He arrived at Marisol's office wearing a canvas jacket over his work clothes. Dust had settled into the seams of his boots. Luis would not sit at first. He stood beside the conference table with his hands in his pockets and looked at the door every time someone passed in the corridor. "You are not being recorded," Marisol told him. "I will take notes. You may stop at any time." He nodded but remained standing. I thanked him for coming. His eyes moved to the ring hanging from my necklace. "Daniel saved me," he said. The words were direct, without performance. Luis told us that Daniel had arrived at the riverfront site angry. He was not shouting at the crew, he was shouting into his phone at someone Luis assumed was in the office. Daniel ordered everyone away from the Eastern Support Line. He showed Caleb a certificate and said the numbers did not match the material delivered. "Did he say North Line?" I asked. Luis thought for a moment. "He said the supplier wasn't cleared. He said somebody skipped the paperwork." "Did you see Daniel approve the area afterward?" "No." "Did anyone tell you he had?" Luis looked down. After the accident, one of the company lawyers said Daniel had changed his mind. They asked whether I remembered him saying the work could continue. "What did you tell them?" "That I didn't hear him say that." Marisol asked, "Were you asked to sign anything?" "They gave me a statement. I didn't sign it." He had been standing near a temporary access platform when Daniel saw movement in the frame above them. Daniel grabbed Luis by the back of his harness and shoved him toward the clear zone. Another worker, Mason Reed, was closer to the failing connection. Daniel reached him next. Mason escaped with a fractured wrist and cuts across his shoulder. Daniel did not make it out. "Will Mason speak with us?" I asked. Luis's hesitation gave me the answer before he did. "His older brother runs one of Martin's concrete crews," he said. "Mason's worried they'll both lose their jobs. My father cannot fire them for telling the truth." Marisol glanced at me. The law and reality were not always the same thing. Luis agreed to let Marisol pass his information to Mercer. He was not ready to sign an affidavit, but he was willing to speak with Tosha again if contacted through counsel. I thanked him. He finally sat down. "There's something else," he said. Daniel kept saying the bolts weren't the bolts on the certificate. "They were bolts?" I asked. "Big structural bolts and connector pieces. They came in heavy boxes. Caleb knew which shipment." That was the first time Caleb Turner's name entered the investigation as more than a line in a personnel file. My father had already offered his version of Caleb. According to Martin, Caleb had a history of taking scrap material from job sites without permission. The company had disciplined him the previous year. Dad suggested Caleb and Daniel might have cooperated to divert materials or hide purchases through Northline. The accusation was convenient. Caleb had access to deliveries. Daniel had authority over project approvals. Northline connected both. Marisol warned me not to approach Caleb alone. She arranged a meeting at the office of an attorney representing several employees in the Tosha investigation. Caleb was 58, broad through the shoulders, with gray hair cut close to his scalp. He wore a clean work shirt and held his cap between both hands. He did not look at me when we were introduced. "I'm sorry about Daniel," he said. "Did you let the crew work after he stopped the job?" His head lifted. Marisol touched my wrist beneath the table, but I kept going. "Daniel told you the connectors were wrong." Luis heard him. "Yet people went back into that area." Caleb's jaw moved. "You think I don't know what happened? I think you know more than you told the investigators." His attorney said, "Natalie, we agreed this would be an information meeting, not an examination." I should have stopped. Instead, grief found the nearest target that was still alive. "My father says you and Daniel were stealing material together. You say nothing. One of you is dead, and the other one still has his pension." Caleb stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. "My pension?" he said. "You think that's what I'm protecting?" He put on his cap. "My wife's insurance comes through that company. She starts another round of treatment in December. Martin knows it, Elaine knows it, everybody in that office knows it. I had not known." Caleb looked at me for the first time. "Daniel told me to clear the east line. I did. Martin called and said the notice was internal, the engineers were still reviewing it, and we could keep a limited crew on the west side. Then the schedule changed on the tablet. The east tasks came back active. Who changed them? I don't know. Did you send anyone back? I told 2 men to check staging near the boundary. Daniel arrived and saw them closer than they should have been." His voice roughened. "He got them out, I didn't." Caleb left before I could respond. In the elevator, Marisol said, "You confused fear with guilt." He still sent them back. "Yes." He stayed silent afterward. "Yes." "And my father is using him." "Yes." Her agreement made the correction sharper. "People can fail Daniel without creating Northline," she said. "Your job is to learn which failure belongs to which person." I had treated Caleb as if the world contained only 2 categories: those who protected Daniel and those who betrayed him. The truth was less convenient. Caleb had obeyed an order he should have challenged. He had been afraid. His fear had consequences. That did not make him the architect of the fraud. I called his attorney the next morning and apologized without asking for anything in return. "I had no right to accuse him of stealing with Daniel," I said. "Please tell him I understand if he never speaks to me again." For 3 days, he did not. During that time, Tosha allowed Marisol, Leona Park, and me to view the restricted area from a designated safe perimeter. We could not touch material, enter the collapse zone, or interfere with the agency's control of the site. Leona was a structural engineer retained by the estate. She had spent 20 years evaluating connection failures and construction defects. She did not speak in dramatic conclusions. She pointed toward a row of exposed steel connections. The pieces at issue are not ordinary hardware, she explained. They are high-strength bolts and connector assemblies. They hold permanent structural members together. So, they were supposed to stay in the building? Yes. During construction, they also carry load as the frame is erected. A defective connection can fail before the building is complete or remain hidden after finishing work covers it. The river moved behind the warehouse, gray beneath the November sky. Wind pushed through gaps in the unfinished exterior and carried the smell of wet concrete and rust. A section of the frame had been stabilized with temporary supports after the collapse. The damaged beam had been removed, but scrape marks remained on the concrete where it had struck. I stopped at the boundary tape. Daniel had stood somewhere beyond it. My body reacted before my mind could turn the place into measurements and evidence. My knees weakened, and the ring beneath my coat seemed heavier against my chest. I did not cross the barrier. I did not ask anyone to let me closer. I stood there until I could breathe evenly again, then asked Leona what Daniel would have seen. She showed me photographs taken by Tosha on the day of the accident. One connector had fractured near the bolt hole. The metal surface looked grainy, where it had split. A fracture can happen for several reasons, she said. Improper installation, excessive load, manufacturing defect, material substitution, or a combination. We need laboratory testing. Could the wrong certificate hide that? A mill certificate is supposed to identify the material's heat lot and test results. If the certificate belongs to a different lot, you lose traceability. Daniel's voicemail returned to me. Follow the delivery, not the invoice. Invoices could be changed. A physical shipment had to come from somewhere. That evening, Caleb's attorney called Marisol. Caleb was willing to meet again, but only at her office and only if Tosha was notified before anything changed hands. When he arrived the next morning, he carried no bag or loose piece of metal. He brought photographs and a written description of an unopened manufacturer's box, stored in a locked maintenance cage at a different Whitaker facility. Daniel told me to hold one full box from the shipment, Caleb said. He said if the paperwork changed, the seal would matter. Why didn't you give it to Tosha immediately? I asked. Because Martin called the night Daniel died and told me every Northline item belonged to the company. He said removing anything would be theft. Caleb looked at Marisol rather than me. I already had that scrap write-up. He told me if I made another mistake, I'd lose my pension. Elaine called the next day and asked how my wife was feeling. The question had sounded compassionate. Caleb had heard the warning inside it. Marisol contacted Mercer while we were in the room. Tosha arranged for the box to be retrieved from the cage with Caleb present. The company was notified through counsel. No one allowed us to quietly move it into the trunk of a car or treat it like a secret prize. At the transfer, Marisol recorded the seal, manufacturer markings, box number, and packing slip. Mercer documented the location and condition. Caleb signed a statement explaining when Daniel asked him to preserve it and why he had delayed reporting it. The box remained unopened until it reached an approved laboratory. Caleb also gave us photographs Daniel had taken on the delivery date. One showed stacked boxes beside the riverfront warehouse. Another showed a white label with a heat lot number. Leona compared the number to the packing slip. They match, she said. The supplier listed on the slip was Northline Industrial. For the first time, Northline was no longer just a name in a creditor claim or a transaction on a screen. It was printed on a shipment tied to the steel that failed. The manufacturer responded to the laboratory's inquiry within 48 hours. The heat lot had been the subject of a technical warning. Samples from the batch had failed to meet the required tensile strength range. The manufacturer said the lot should not have been represented as compliant for the structural application shown in Daniel's project records. That did not yet prove every connect gather. It did not gather. It did not prove the fracture alone caused the collapse. It did prove Daniel had been right to stop the work. The packing records created a second problem. The Northline shipment had not gone only to the riverfront warehouse. Delivery records showed boxes bearing the same heat lot number had been divided among 3 Whitaker construction projects. One was the warehouse. The second was an office renovation still under construction. The third was a converted textile building where restaurants and shops had already opened in completed sections while construction continued elsewhere. Leona was careful with her words. "We do not know that installed connections at either site are defective," she said. "We know material from a warned lot may have been delivered. Both sites need inspection." Marisol sent the records to Mercer and the appropriate building authorities through documented channels. My father called me less than an hour later. "What did you give the state?" His voice told me he knew before any formal notice had reached him. "Talk to your attorney." "Natalie, if regulators shut down 3 projects because of incomplete information, people will lose their jobs. Then you should have given them complete information after Daniel died. You do not understand construction." "No." Dad lowered his voice. "Caleb is protecting himself. He has stolen from the company before. He took discarded scrap and returned the money after you disciplined him. That does not make him responsible for your vendor records. You have no idea what Daniel was involved in. Then prove it without asking me to sign his confession." I ended the call. That night, Leona sent a preliminary comparison note. The unopened box preserved by Caleb and a sample controlled by Tosha bore the same heat lot markings. Their physical characteristics were consistent enough to justify full laboratory comparison, but the official material file Whitaker Construction had given investigators listed a completely different heat lot, one with valid certification. I read the 2 numbers several times. The material at the site matched the shipment Daniel had questioned. The company file described a safer shipment that did not appear to be there. Someone had not merely changed whether Daniel approved the work. Someone had changed the identity of the steel that killed him. The first bank record with Daniel's name on it frightened me more than the altered safety report. A forged approval could be explained by stolen credentials. A payment account called Daniel Ross Consulting suggested planning, ownership, and intent. It suggested that while Daniel came home each night and told me he was trying to fix my father's company, he might have been building a second business with money taken from it. Whitaker Construction submitted the account records as additional support for its creditor claim in the first week of November. According to the summary, Northline had transferred more than $180,000 into Daniel Ross Consulting over 9 months. My father's attorney called it evidence of self-dealing. My mother called it proof that grief had blinded me. She did not say those words to me directly. She said them to women from her church, 2 members of the Historical Preservation Board, and an old family friend whose husband had once invested in one of Dad's projects. By the end of the week, people were no longer asking whether Daniel had done something wrong. They were asking whether I had known. I did not respond publicly. The reason was not restraint alone. Daniel had drafted a business plan. I found it in our personal cloud storage inside a folder labeled Future. It outlined a small consulting firm that would help regional contractors review procurement systems, construction safety records, and vendor compliance. The proposed name was Daniel Ross Consulting. The file had been created 7 months before his death. I read it at the kitchen table where I had listened to his final voicemail. The first page described his experience at Whitaker Construction. The financial section estimated what he would need to leave the company, pay for health insurance, rent office space, and survive a year without steady clients. He had written notes in the margins. Talk to Natalie before resigning. Do not use Whitaker client list. Confirm non-solicitation terms with Marisol. He had planned to tell me. He had not done it yet. That distinction did not erase the anger. I had spent weeks defending him while learning, piece by piece, how much of his life he had kept outside our marriage. He had hired Marisol, preserved reports, prepared to leave my father's company, and created a plan that would change both our lives. I understood why he had been careful around Martin. I did not understand why he had been careful around me. That night, I took Daniel's ring from the chain and placed it on the table. "You should have told me," I said to the empty room. The anger was easier to hold than grief. Anger made Daniel feel close enough to argue with. I searched the rest of the Future folder and found an older project file from 2 years earlier. Daniel had saved a copy of a closeout report for a municipal parking structure. Across the top, he had typed a private note. "I won't sign another inaccurate summary." Below it was a paragraph he had removed from the official report. It described a temporary bracing problem that had delayed the project but caused no injuries. The final company version reduced the issue to a scheduling conflict. I sent the file to Marisol. She called the following morning. Daniel mentioned this project when he first contacted me, she said. Did he falsify the report? He signed a summary he believed was misleading. That is not an answer. It is the answer I can give before I review the complete file. Did he break the law? I do not know. I stood at my office window watching rain collect along the parking lot curbs. Everyone keeps telling me Daniel was protecting me. I did not say that. No, he did, without asking whether I wanted to be protected. Marisol let the silence remain. Finally, she said, You are allowed to be angry with him and still insist the evidence against him be real. That became the standard I used. I stopped asking whether Daniel was capable of keeping secrets. He was. I started asking whether the bank account proved he stole money. Through the contested probate proceeding, Marisol subpoenaed the account opening documents from the bank. The response arrived in an encrypted file 9 days later. The first page contained Daniel's full legal name, date of birth, social security number, and employee address from Whitaker Construction's personnel system. His electronic signature appeared at the bottom. At first glance, it looked genuine. The second page did not. The contact email was daniel.ross@rossconsulting.com. The letter that looked like a lowercase l in consulting was actually a capital I. The real domain Daniel had reserved for his future business used the correct spelling and had never hosted email. The bank's fraud department provided the internet address used during the application. It came from Whitaker Construction's office network on a Tuesday afternoon when Daniel's site access record and a client meeting calendar placed him 40 miles away. The signature image had also been pasted at a different resolution from the rest of the application. A bank employee could not tell us who opened the account. The records established only that someone used Daniel's personnel information, a deceptive email address, and Whitaker Construction's network. It was the first clear sign that Daniel Ross Consulting existed in two forms. One was a real plan Daniel had created but never launched. The other was an account someone built around that private truth. They knew enough to make the lie believable, I told Marisol. Yes. Who had access to his business plan? We do not know that they saw the plan. They used the exact name. Daniel may have mentioned it at work. The domain registration may have been discoverable. His computer may have been accessed. Every answer widened the group of possibilities. I wanted one name. Evidence gave me access patterns instead. The bank records showed the account received money but made no direct payments to Daniel's personal accounts. Most transfers moved onward within 48 hours. The destination descriptions were vague: consulting retainers and event services. Marisol subpoenaed those accounts too. While we waited, April Monroe contacted her. April managed inventory, accounting, and vendor documentation at Whitaker Construction. I had seen her at Christmas dinners and company picnics for years. She was quiet, precise, and usually seated near the edge of a room with a calculator or stack of receipts in front of her. She agreed to meet us at a 24-hour diner outside downtown after her shift. She brought her own attorney. The diner smelled of fryer oil and maple syrup. April chose a booth where she could see the front door. I'm not here because I suddenly got brave, she said before Marisol could begin. I'm here because I heard Martin is blaming Caleb. She removed a folded sheet of paper from her purse. It was not a stolen company document. It was a list she had prepared from memory and from records already produced through formal channels. Northline never completed vendor onboarding, she said. No signed tax form, no current insurance certificate, no reference check, no approved banking verification. How did it get paid? I asked. A temporary vendor code. Who could create one? Controller Access or Finance Administration. Paige was the company controller. April looked down at her coffee. Paige told me Daniel approved Northline verbally because the riverfront job was behind schedule. She said the tax paperwork would follow. Did you ask Daniel? I emailed him. What did he say? He asked what Northline was. That email had not appeared in the records Whitaker Construction gave Tosha or the probate court. April had not saved a private copy, but she remembered the subject line and approximate date. Marisol could request it from the company's archived email system and outside provider. Why didn't you stop the payments? I asked. I froze the vendor once. What happened? A line came to my desk. My mother had no official finance role. She served as director of community relations and attended executive meetings whenever she believed the family image was involved. April wrapped both hands around her mug. She asked how my son was doing in the apprenticeship program. Then she reminded me that layoffs usually started with the newest hires. Did she threaten you? Not in words I could put in a complaint. That was how Elaine operated. She rarely gave people a sentence they could quote. She placed two facts beside each other and let fear connect them. April reactivated Northline. I told myself Daniel would review it, she said. Then the money kept moving. Did Caleb have access to any of this? No, Caleb could confirm delivery and assign material to a job. He couldn't create a vendor, change banking information, or approve payments. Marisol asked April to explain the permissions in ordinary language. She drew 3 boxes on a paper napkin. Caleb could receive. Daniel could approve technical use and certain project costs. Finance could create the vendor and release the money. Could Daniel have done all 3 through someone else's access? I asked. Anyone can steal a password, April said. But the system records which role completed each step. Northline was created through finance administration. The banking profile was entered through controller-level access. Page's level. That did not prove she was the person at the keyboard. Other senior users might have shared credentials or delegated access. I had learned not to turn a strong lead into a verdict. April's attorney arranged for her statement to be provided through the proper channels. Marisol requested the vendor access matrix and archive logs. The access matrix arrived 3 days later. Caleb had no permission to create Northline, approve its banking details, or insert Daniel's electronic signature. His old scrap violation made him an easy suspect, but the financial system excluded him from the core transactions. I called him after his attorney approved the contact. The access records clear you from creating the account, I said. They clear me from that. He did not ask for praise. I still sent men back after Daniel stopped the work. I know. I keep thinking if I had told Martin no, Daniel wouldn't have gone into that section. I did not tell him it was not his fault. That would have been another form of dishonesty. You should have refused, I said. My father should never have ordered it. Both things can be true. Caleb was quiet. Then he said, Daniel told me something when we checked the shipment. He said invoices are stories people write after they decide what they want a purchase to look like. I remembered the voicemail. Followed the delivery, not the invoice. Yes, Caleb said. That was it. The delivery had led us to the steal. The money led somewhere else. The first complete transfer record arrived in the middle of November. Northline had received a payment from Whitaker Construction, transferred part of it to the false Daniel Ross consulting account, and sent another portion to a Nashville event company called Ark and Laurel Events. Ark and Laurel had then paid $40,000 to the ballroom where Page planned to marry Grant. The payment had been made 6 weeks before Daniel died. I read the record several times, checking the account numbers and dates. Page had claimed the wedding fund would become available after the estate settlement. Yet someone had already used money from Northline to secure her venue while Daniel was alive. That could be a legitimate company event payment, I said, forcing myself to test the innocent explanation. Marisol nodded. It could. The ballroom hosts corporate events. It does. Ark and Laurel could have had more than one client. Yes. We requested the underlying contracts rather than announcing what we thought we had found. The ballroom's record answered first. The deposit was attached to Paige Whitaker and Grant Holloway's wedding reservation. The payment memo described it as a private event deposit. Ark and Laurel's internal reference used Paige's initials and wedding date. Grant's name appeared on the contract. His signature did not appear on the payment authorization. I did not call him. I did not call Paige. I added the record to the evidence table and waited for the rest of the subpoena return. The Northline account opening file arrived late that Friday afternoon. The company had been registered through an online business service using a mailing address in East Nashville. At first, the address looked unremarkable. 1 unit in a renovated apartment building. Marisol searched county property and utility records. The lease had once been held by Paige Whitaker. She had lived there for 18 months before moving back into my parents' house. The registration date fell 3 weeks before Northline received its first payment. Marisol placed the record beside the ballroom deposit. "This is a connection," she said. "It is not yet proof she operated the company." I stared at Paige's old address beneath Northline's name. My sister had cried at Daniel's funeral. She had hugged me while a wedding deadline glowed on her phone. She had asked me to sign the settlement so everyone could move on. Until that moment, I had believed Paige was accepting stolen money because my parents had trained her never to question what they gave her. The address forced me to consider something worse. Paige might not have been waiting for their plan to save her wedding. She might have helped create it before Daniel died. Paige's old address connected her to Northline, but Marisol would not let me call it proof. "An address can be copied," she said. "It can stay on an old account. Someone can choose it because they know she once lived there. She was the company controller. That makes the connection important. It does not tell us who created the registration." I understood the distinction. I hated it anyway. By the middle of November, every piece of information seemed to arrive with a warning label. Strong did not mean complete. Suspicious did not mean admissible. A fact could point directly at someone and still stop short of proving that person had acted. The forensic examiner retained through the estate gave us the clearest example. He confirmed that Daniel's company account had opened the Riverfront Safety Report 2 hours after the hospital pronounced him dead. The same session changed the report's status from rejected to approved. The internet address came from the hospital's guest network. I stared at the line in his report. Paige was at the hospital. So were dozens of visitors, employees, contractors, and patients' relatives, Marisol said. "A guest network address identifies a network, not a person," the examiner agreed. The log told us where the session originated. It did not tell us who had touched the keyboard. Marisol sought subpoenas for the hospital's visitor area security footage, parking records, and guest network device logs. None of that came from Daniel's medical chart. His treatment records remained separate. We were looking only for security and technical information created in the public areas of the building. Mercer asked the hospital to preserve the same data for the safety investigation. By then, the account alteration had also been referred to investigators reviewing possible computer fraud and evidence tampering. The records arrived in pieces. The first piece was the inventory trail for Daniel's company equipment. My father had signed the receipt showing he reclaimed Daniel's laptop and phone. A parking camera at the hospital showed him placing a black laptop bag inside a Whitaker Construction SUV shortly after he arrived. That act alone proved nothing. The devices belonged to the company, and recovering them after an employee's death could have been ordinary procedure. The next camera angle made it less ordinary. At 3:12 that afternoon, Paige left the family waiting area, crossed the visitor entrance, and walked toward the company SUV. 18 minutes later, she came back carrying the black laptop bag. She told a hospital security officer that she needed to retrieve company property for her father. The officer noted the interaction because Paige had asked which lobby had the strongest guest Wi-Fi. Marisol read that sentence twice. "Still not proof she changed the report," she said. "No, but it explains how Daniel's laptop reached the hospital network." The guest network records identified a device with the same hardware address later found in Whitaker Construction's inventory backup. It connected during the period Paige was away from the family room. The examiner then matched that device to the session that opened Daniel's account. The login did not require someone to type Daniel's password. His laptop still held a remembered session cookie. Opening the safety system triggered a secondary authentication request through the company's vendor portal. That approval went to a token registered to a phone number ending in 4821. I knew the number. Paige had used it for years. April confirmed it was also the number attached to Paige's controller profile in the vendor system. The chain was no longer one suspicious internet address. It was Daniel's laptop, the hospital network, the 18-minute window, and Paige's authentication token. I should have let Marisol and the investigators continue. Instead, I asked Paige to meet me. Part of me still wanted an explanation that would place her beside the wrongdoing rather than inside it. I wanted her to tell me Dad had ordered her to collect the laptop, that Elaine had taken her phone, that she had approved a request without understanding what it changed. That hope was not innocence. It was habit. For most of my life, Paige had made a bad choice, cried, and waited for someone else to identify the person who had pressured her. I had helped do it more times than I wanted to remember. We met at a quiet coffee shop near Belmead. Paige arrived in a cream coat with her hair pulled back. She looked tired, but her wedding planning binder was sticking out of her tote bag. She did not order anything. "You told Grant I stole your old address to frame you," I said. Her face tightened. "He had a right to know you were coming after me." I asked him where the wedding money came from. "You made it sound criminal. Was Northline registered at your old apartment?" "I haven't lived there in years." "That wasn't my question." She looked toward the front window. "Dad's company used addresses connected to family members all the time. Storage, mail, temporary registration. I didn't handle every form." "You had controller access. So did other people. Did Dad ask you to retrieve Daniel's laptop at the hospital?" Her eyes returned to mine. "What does that have to do with anything? Did he?" "Yes, the company needed its property." "Why did you ask about the guest Wi-Fi?" "I had vendor payments waiting. Daniel had just died, and Dad was trying to keep 120 people employed." The answer came too quickly and contained more detail than I had offered. "What did you approve from Daniel's laptop?" Paige's expression changed. Not much. A pause, a tightening around her mouth. Then tears filled her eyes. "You waited until Daniel was dead to turn me into your enemy." "I'm asking what you did." "I did inventory. I checked pending items. Dad told me the company could collapse if we lost access to the project files." "Did you use the token attached to your phone?" She pushed back from the table. "You subpoenaed my phone?" "I didn't say that." "You're investigating me while Mom is trying to keep the family together and Dad is trying to save the company. You don't care what happens to anyone but Daniel. He died because someone changed the truth, and you've decided it had to be me." "I haven't decided anything. I'm giving you the chance to explain." Paige wiped her face and stood. "No, you're giving me the chance to confess to whatever story your lawyer built." She left the coffee shop without touching her wedding planning binder. I sat alone for several minutes, replaying the conversation. The moment I reached Marisol's office, I told her exactly what I had asked. She did not raise her voice. "You disclosed the laptop and the token?" I did not tell her about the device identifier. "You told her enough to know where the investigation is going." I thought she might cooperate. "You hoped she would make you feel better about suspecting her." The accuracy of that hurt. The next morning, Paige reported her phone damaged. According to her attorney, it had fallen into a sink while she was washing makeup brushes. She replaced it before investigators could arrange a voluntary inspection. The original device was not recovered. My mistake did not destroy the case. Preservation notices had already reached the mobile provider, the vendor platform host, and the outside information technology company. They retained token registration records, authentication events, and cloud backups independent of Paige's phone. But the device itself might have contained local messages, cached files, or evidence showing who had held it during the hospital session. I had warned her. I added that mistake to my timeline, rather than inventing an excuse for it. Daniel had once told me that intelligence was not the same as never being wrong. Intelligence was recognizing when pride had entered the decision and correcting course before it cost more. After that meeting, I stopped contacting Paige directly. The next important discovery came from a detail so small my father's attorney had probably never noticed it. Daniel labeled his working drafts. The copy he sent Marisol before the accident carried a footer that read DR-17. Between two paragraphs, he had also left a slightly wider space. It was not a trap involving false safety information. It was ordinary version control, the kind he used so he could tell which copy someone was reviewing. The company claimed Daniel later approved a final report. That supposed final file also carried DR-17 and the same harmless spacing pattern. If Daniel finalized it, why would it keep the working draft marker? I asked. "It should not," the examiner said. Daniel's standard process created a new version number when he signed a report. The final copy would have carried DR-18, a locked digital certificate, and a separate archive entry. No DR-18 existed. Someone had opened the old working draft, changed, rejected to approved, pasted in Daniel's electronic signature, and presented the altered copy as his final decision. The marker did not identify the person who made the change. The device and token records did that work. Together, they established something stronger than either could alone. Daniel had never created the approved version. The full bank returns arrived 3 days later. Marisol spread them across the conference table and reduced the money trail to 3 steps. First, Whitaker Construction paid Northline for structural materials and related services. Second, Northline split the money. One portion went to the false Daniel Ross consulting account. Another went through ARC and Laurel Events to vendors connected to Paige's wedding. Third, most of the money placed under Daniel's name moved back into a reserve account controlled by Whitaker Construction. The false consulting account had not enriched Daniel. It had held money briefly, made it look as though he had received personal payments, and then returned the funds to an account the company used to cover project shortages. The money had left Whitaker Construction, worn Daniel's name for a few days, and come back clean enough to hide where it started. The wedding money did not come back. $95,000 had reached Paige's vendors. $40,000 went to the ballroom deposit. $28,000 went to ARC and Laurel for design, rentals, and coordination. $17,000 went to a florist. $10,000 went toward a house furnishing package Paige had arranged for after the wedding. Those payments stretched across months. They were not a desperate decision made after Daniel died. They showed that Paige had benefited from Northline while Daniel was still alive and questioning the vendor. Grant's salary and Paige's salary were high, but their planned wedding cost roughly $180,000, and they were preparing to buy a house close to $900,000. Their income supported a comfortable life. It did not explain the deposits they had already paid, while insisting they had little cash available. The subpoenaed records also showed that Grant had signed the venue contract, but had not authorized the payments. The shared wedding account listed Paige and Elaine as the contacts for financial changes. I thought about calling Grant. I did not. Marisol sent the bank package to the investigators and added it to the estate's formal objection to the creditor claim. For the first time, the evidence formed one continuous story. Paige's old address connected her to Northline. Her controller access connected her to its creation. Her phone token connected her to the altered report. Her wedding vendors connected her to the money. Daniel's false account connected the fraud to the accusation against his estate. My parents had not found a convenient way to use Daniel's death after the accident. The structure had already existed. His death gave them the chance to finish it and place every remaining liability on a man who could no longer object. 2 days later, a local business website published an article with the headline, "Widow Blocks Settlement as Contractor Fights Late Executive Secret Vendor Scheme." The article said I had refused a private resolution that would preserve Daniel Ross's reputation while acknowledging his exclusive control over the disputed accounts. I read the sentence again. Exclusive control. That phrase did not appear in the public creditor claim. It appeared only in the confidential settlement draft exchanged between the lawyers. Someone with access to the private negotiations had given it to the reporter. The bank records showed Paige had used Daniel's name to move money. The article showed my mother was ready to use mine to destroy anyone who believed me. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning, but the damage had begun before most people finished breakfast. By 9, 2 board members from my workplace had forwarded it to me. At 10, a former Whitaker Construction client asked whether Daniel had used my position to hide money. Before lunch, someone left a printed copy beneath the windshield wiper of my car. I carried it into Marisol's office without folding it. The reporter had quoted a phrase from the settlement proposal, "Exclusive control over the disputed vendor accounts." That wording did not appear in the public creditor claim. It existed only in the confidential draft exchanged between the 2 legal teams. Marisol placed the article beside her copy of the settlement. 6 people received this exact version, she said. 2 on our side, 4 on theirs. Can we prove who leaked it? Not yet. She created a written log of every recipient, the date the file had been sent, and the electronic addresses used. Then she issued preservation demands covering email accounts, document sharing logs, and communications with the reporter. I opened my laptop and wrote a response. Daniel did not control Northline. His account was used after his death. Money from Northline paid my sister's wedding vendors. The company altered his safety report while he lay dead in a hospital. Every sentence was true. Marisol read the draft and closed the screen. If you publish this, Paige knows exactly which financial records we have. Elaine knows we traced the settlement leak. Martin knows the safety report is now connected to the estate investigation. They are calling Daniel a thief. They want you angry enough to reveal the investigation for them. I hated the logic because it was sound. My silence had always been useful to my family. This time, however, I was not silent because they had intimidated me. I was silent because I had chosen the timing. I saved the response in a private folder and did not publish it. 2 days later, Elaine appeared at a charity luncheon hosted by a regional children's foundation. I was not there. The foundation posted the event recording on its public website, and an old family friend sent the link to me with a message asking whether I had seen what my mother said. Elaine stood at a podium beneath a banner about resilience and community care. She wore soft gray and spoke without notes. My family has endured a devastating season, she told the room. We lost a man we loved, and we discovered that grief does not erase the consequences of decisions made under stress. She never said Daniel had stolen money. She did not need to. She spoke about protecting employees, honoring commitments, and repairing damage without humiliating the dead. Then she asked the audience to pray for a family member who had allowed pain to become anger. The camera showed several women nodding. My mother had turned me into the threat without using my name. I watched the recording twice. The first time, I heard the accusations. The second time, I studied the construction. Daniel had made decisions under stress. My parents were repairing damage. I was acting from anger. Elaine's version gave every person in the room a role they already understood. Martin was the burdened employer. Paige was the grieving bride. Elaine was the mother holding everyone together. I was the widow refusing peace. She had always been skilled at making cruelty sound like concern. When Paige failed a class in high school, Mom told people the teacher lacked compassion. When Dad fired an employee who questioned his accounting, Mom described the man as unstable. When I stopped attending Sunday dinners after Daniel and Martin began fighting, Mom said marriage had made me distant. She did not invent facts from nothing. She arranged them until only one conclusion seemed polite. I downloaded the public video, saved the page address and upload date, and sent both to Marisol. Then I went back to work. That choice became harder after Caleb delivered a recording from an employee meeting at Whitaker Construction. He had attended the meeting and recorded it openly on his phone because several workers were joining by video and the company had said employees could keep notes. His attorney transferred the original file to Marisol with the date, device information, and Caleb's statement. Martin's voice filled the conference room speakers. The company remains committed to payroll, he told the employees. But outside legal attacks are freezing funds we need to operate. No one in the recording said my name at first. Martin waited until someone asked whether the creditor dispute could close the company. Then he answered, Daniel's estate is refusing a reasonable resolution. Until that changes, every paycheck depends on how long the attack continues. A worker asked whether Martin meant me. Dad paused before saying, Natalie controls the estate. That was enough. Within 2 days, 3 employees sent me messages asking whether I planned to take their health insurance away. Caleb's hours were reduced. April's son was removed from the apprenticeship schedule and told there was no work available for new hires. Martin did not fire either of them. He did not write that they were being punished for cooperating. The changes were presented as ordinary cost-cutting. The timing made the message clear. I took the recording to Marisol. If I withdraw the claim objection, what happens to the employees? The company receives leverage over the estate. It does not guarantee payroll. What if I agree to a temporary payment? You would be financing the people who filed a false claim against Daniel. I'm asking whether there is a way to protect the workers without protecting my parents. Marisol considered that before answering, not through a private payment to Martin. If the company becomes insolvent, employee protection has to come through a structured process, lender oversight, or a sale. You cannot personally manage a company you do not own. I knew that. Still, part of me had wanted a clean option in which I paid enough to keep the innocent people safe while continuing the fight. There was no clean option. I sent one written statement to the employees who had contacted me. I did not discuss evidence or blame. I said only that Daniel's estate had not frozen company payroll, had not sought control of operating accounts, and had not requested layoffs or reduced hours. After that, I stopped responding. Martin wanted every worker to see me as the person choosing whether they ate. I refused the role. The next pressure point was Luis Mendoza. He had agreed to speak with Tosha again about Daniel ordering the crew out of the eastern section. Before the interview, his attorney called Marisol and said Luis no longer remembered hearing a stop work instruction. The change was like too specific to be ordinary fear. I asked whether we could speak with him. Not directly, Marisol said. His attorney asked us not to contact him. 3 days later, Luis's attorney delivered a voicemail Luis had preserved from Elaine. My mother's tone was warm. Luis, I heard your brother may be moving into a permanent position with the concrete division. That would be wonderful for your parents. Stability matters so much after an accident. Health coverage, steady hours, all the things families depend on. She paused. I also hope no one is pressuring you to remember things differently than they happened. Daniel was under tremendous strain. And grief can make people certain about conversations they only partly heard. Your family has already been through enough. There was no direct threat. Elaine did not tell him to lie. She did not mention firing his brother or canceling insurance. She placed employment, health coverage, and memory in the same message and trusted Luis to understand. Marisol transferred the voicemail to the investigators with its original file information and Luis's written account of when he received it. Is that witness intimidation? I asked. It is evidence of pressure, she said. The investigators will decide how it fits with the rest. We do not name a crime before the facts support it. Luis did not return to his original statement immediately. That hurt. But I understood him better than I had understood Caleb. My mother's weapon was not simply fear. It was the belief that accepting harm was the responsible choice when other people's security depended on your silence. I had lived under the same belief for years. By early December, I was sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night. I worked all day, reviewed records in the evening, and woke before dawn to replay details I could not change. I missed a deadline at my job for the first time in 6 years. The error was small. I had approved a vendor report without attaching the final supporting page, and a colleague caught it before it went forward. No one was harmed. That did not stop me from sitting in my office after everyone left, staring at the missing attachment as though it proved I could no longer trust myself. My supervisor closed the door behind her. You need time off, she said. I need to finish this review. You finished it. You are still sitting here. I looked at the page. Daniel had hidden parts of his work from me because he thought he could contain the problem. I had spent weeks condemning that choice while doing the same thing with my grief. I took 2 personal days and made an appointment with a grief counselor. Her office had a blue chair, a box of tissues I refused to touch, and a clock that made each silence measurable. She asked what I feared would happen if I stopped working on the investigation for 1 day. They will change the story. Who? My parents. The company. Anyone who finds their version easier. And what happens if you keep working every minute? I stay ahead of them. She waited. I heard how impossible the answer sounded. The investigation could clear Daniel. It could not remove the fact that he had kept secrets from me. It could not return the 10 years we had shared or give me the conversation he had promised after leaving the riverfront site. I had been using the evidence to avoid a different question. Was I angry with a dead man? Yes, I said. It was the first time I admitted it aloud. I was angry that Daniel had trusted Marisol with records he did not trust me to see. I was angry that he had planned a new career without asking whether I wanted the risk. I was angry that his last message left me with instructions, instead of a goodbye I had known was final. None of that made the creditor claim true. None of it made him responsible for Northline. The counselor helped me separate grief from the legal work. I could be furious with Daniel for shutting me out and still refuse to let my family build a crime around that flaw. I left with no sudden peace. I left with a practical rule. Before taking any action, I asked myself whether it served the evidence or only relieved my feelings. That rule kept me from calling Elaine after April contacted investigators about a folder called Holiday Outreach. April had seen the folder in the executive shared drive several times. Elaine used it when requesting employee contact information for Christmas cards, charity events, and family support programs. April remembered one occasion when Elaine opened a spreadsheet and asked which employees had spouses receiving company insurance. She did not copy the file. She did not enter the folder after deciding to cooperate. She simply told investigators where she had seen it. A court preservation order had already been issued for relevant company data. The forensic team created an image of the server, preserving active files, version histories, and recoverable deleted copies. Inside Holiday Outreach, they found a spreadsheet with 37 names. The columns were labeled Contacted, Cooperative, Follow-up, Family Connection, and Stability Concern. Luis's row listed his brother's employment and his parents' dependence on company health coverage. Caleb's row mentioned his pension and his wife's treatment. April's row listed her son's apprenticeship. Beside one employee who had refused to describe Daniel as unstable, Elaine had written, "Remind him who approved his leave last year." The spreadsheet had been updated after phone calls, home visits, and community events. Some names were highlighted in green. Others were yellow. Luis had changed from yellow to green the day after Elaine left the voicemail. I read the entries in Marisol's conference room while the forensic examiner explained that the server image preserved the file's creation date, editing account, and version history. The spreadsheet had been created under Elaine's executive credentials. Deleted versions showed earlier labels. The column later called Stability Concern had first been titled Leverage. Elaine had renamed it, but the server remembered. My mother had not been improvising kind conversations with frightened employees. She had been managing them. Marisol sent the authenticated file, version history, and examiner's declaration to the investigators. She also asked the probate court for additional protection against destruction or alteration of company records, relevant to the false claim. The forensic examiner continued reviewing the server image through the evening. At 7:30, he found a folder of draft legal documents beneath an archive directory used by Elaine's office. There were 3 versions of the creditor claim against Daniel's estate. The final one accused him of creating Northline, taking company. The second used softer language and left several amounts blank. The first was only 4 pages long. Marisol opened its properties and turned the screen toward me. The creation time was 11:48 on the night Daniel died, 6 days before the funeral. 3 weeks before Whitaker Construction claimed it had completed an internal review. My mother had begun writing Daniel's guilt before his body had left the hospital. The first draft of the creditor claim had been created on the night Daniel died, but the number inside it came from a document Paige had no reason to be reviewing that evening. The forensic team found the connection in the company server image. In March of the previous year, Martin had offered Daniel a small economic interest in Whitaker Construction as part of a retention agreement. Daniel was not becoming a full partner. The arrangement gave him a limited share of future profits and required the company to buy back that interest if he left or died. Because the company's lender wanted to evaluate everyone tied to the agreement, Daniel had submitted a personal financial statement. It listed his investments, the rental property, the proceeds from his inherited cabin, and the value of the company buyback note. The total was close to $1 million. Paige had accessed that statement 3 times through her controller account. The first access occurred during the original review in 2024. The second happened several months later when the company renewed its line of credit. The third happened at 10:56 on the night Daniel died. At 11:12, Paige forwarded the statement to Elaine's executive account. At 11:48, my mother created the first draft of the creditor claim. The timeline was not an assumption built from similar numbers. The server preserved the access log, forwarding header, attachment identifier, and file history. Paige had handed my mother the value of Daniel's estate while his body was still at the hospital. I sat across from Marisol as the forensic examiner walked us through each entry. Could Paige argue she sent it for insurance or payroll purposes? I asked. She can explain her reason, he said. The records only establish what she accessed, what she forwarded, and when. Marisol turned to me. The draft claim then used figures taken from that statement. That creates the link Elaine tried to hide. The first draft did not yet mention the final loss calculation of $892,000. It said only that Daniel's estate contained sufficient assets to reimburse the company, and that immediate action was required before Natalie obtained control. Before I obtained control, I had been sitting beside Daniel's hospital bed when my mother began drafting a plan to reach his assets before the court appointed me executor. I had spent weeks asking whether Paige understood the purpose of the creditor claim. The server answered part of that question. She knew exactly how much money Daniel had. Grant answered another part 6 days later. He called Marisol's office rather than calling me directly. He said the lender reviewing the house he and Paige planned to buy had requested updated proof of funds. Paige had given him a letter stating that a family reimbursement would be available after the estate dispute was resolved. Grant wanted to know whether the letter was true. Marisol arranged for us to meet in her conference room. He arrived alone, carrying a folder from the mortgage lender. His wedding was less than 5 weeks away, but he looked less like a groom than a man who had discovered the floor beneath him was not attached to anything. He placed the letter on the table. It had no bank name, escrow number, or attorney verification. It was a statement signed by Elaine saying Paige would receive family funds after the resolution of a business reimbursement involving Daniel's estate. "Did Daniel ever promise you money?" I asked. Grant rubbed his thumb along the edge of the folder. "Paige said he wanted to help us with the house. That wasn't my question." "No, Daniel never told me that." "Did you see a will, a gift letter, or a loan agreement?" "No." "Did you ask why his estate would owe Paige anything?" Grant looked toward Marisol as if hoping she would soften the question. She did not. "I thought it was connected to the company," he said. "Paige told me Martin had covered some of Daniel's business losses and the estate would reimburse him." "And Martin planned to give that money to her?" "That was what I understood." "You understood my husband had caused losses large enough to take most of his estate, but my father could still give part of the recovery to a wedding and a house?" Grant's face tightened. "When you say it that way, it sounds ridiculous." It sounded convenient the way Paige said it. He did not deny that. Grant earned a good salary. He was not a man who needed my family's money to eat or keep a roof over his head. He wanted the house, the ballroom, and the version of his future Paige had sold him. He had noticed that the numbers did not make sense and chosen not to ask because the answer benefited him. "I should have questioned it," he said. "Yes. I didn't know about Northline. I believe you didn't know the name." That was not the same as believing him innocent of every choice. He slid the proof of funds letter toward Marisol. "My lender has a copy. I wanted you to have one before Paige replaces it." Marisol accepted it through a documented transfer and asked whether he would provide a statement about what Paige had told him. Grant hesitated. "If I do this, there may not be a wedding. There may not be a mortgage either," I said. "You should decide which fact matters more." He agreed to give a limited statement. He would confirm the letter, the claim that Daniel had promised help, and his own failure to verify it. He did not become my ally that day. He became a man who had finally realized silence would not protect the life he wanted. Paige called me that evening. She asked to meet without lawyers. I said no. She asked whether Marisol could sit outside the room. I still said no. The final arrangement was a private meeting in Marisol's office, with our attorneys present but seated at the far end of the conference table. Paige's attorney objected to recording, so Marisol took written notes and confirmed the discussion in a follow-up letter. Paige arrived in a camel coat and carried no wedding binder. For several minutes, she talked about our childhood. She reminded me that Dad had taken me to job sites while she stayed home with Mom. She said teachers expected her to be as organized as I was. She described family dinners where Martin asked about my promotions and then told Paige she should learn from me. Some of it was true. Our parents had compared us. They had praised me for being capable and protected Paige by assuming she was not. I had sometimes enjoyed being the one people trusted. I had sometimes spoken to Paige as though she were younger than she was. Those were real wounds. They did not create Northline. "I know what it felt like to be compared," I said. "I'm asking what you did after Daniel found the connectors." Paige's eyes filled. "Dad was going to lose the company. That doesn't answer me. You think you understand him because you stayed away? You gotta build your own career while I was trapped there fixing everything. You were paid $145,000 a year to serve as controller. You think money means I had power? You had enough power to create a vendor." Her attorney shifted. Paige folded her arms. "Dad approved every major decision. Did he force you to use Daniel's account after Daniel died?" "I was trying to preserve project access. Did you know Daniel rejected the connectors?" She looked at me but did not answer. I waited. Paige began talking about the bank. Martin had guaranteed company debt with the family house. Elaine had promised the wedding vendors money. Employees would lose health insurance. Grant would leave if he discovered how unstable everything was. I let her finish. Then I repeated the question. Did you know Daniel rejected the connectors? Her face changed from grief to resentment. You always get to ask the clean question after everyone else has lived through the mess. That is still not an answer. You left the company. Daniel stayed and acted like he was better than everyone who couldn't walk away. He tried to stop unsafe work. He was going to report Northline. Was he wrong? Paige leaned forward. You don't understand what would have happened. The lender would have frozen the line. Dad would have lost everything. Mom would have blamed me. 120 people would have wondered why one mistake cost them their jobs. One mistake did not create the false account, change the report, and take money to wedding vendors. Her attorney told her not to respond. Paige ignored him. I can fix the money. How? You sign the settlement. After the wedding, I'll make sure part of it comes back to you. The proposal was so revealing that for a moment I said nothing. She thought the central problem was the amount I would lose. You want me to sign a statement saying Daniel controlled Northline. It doesn't have to be public. It will go to the insurer, the lender, the probate court, and the investigators. Those things can be handled. By changing another record? Paige flinched. I did not mention the hospital laptop, authentication token, bank trail, or server access. I had made that mistake once. I would not give her a map of the evidence again. Instead, I asked one final question. When Daniel gave you the chance to tell the truth, why didn't you take it? Her eyes sharpened. I had not told her I knew he had offered. Her attorney immediately ended the meeting. Paige stood, pulled on her coat, and stopped beside my chair. You've always needed me to be the bad sister so you can be the good one, she said. No, I replied. I needed you to be my sister. You decided that wasn't enough. She left without looking back. The next morning, Grant contacted Marisol again. He had reviewed the shared wedding planning account he and Paige used to approve vendors. Until then, he had focused on contracts and guest lists, while Paige and Elaine handled payments. After meeting me, he searched the archived messages. The app contained a voice memo Paige had sent to the wedding planner on September 22nd. Daniel had been dead for 4 days. His funeral was still 2 days away. Paige's voice sounded impatient rather than grieving. The estate settlement should clear the final balance. My parents guaranteed it. Don't release the ballroom date just because the transfer hasn't happened yet. The planner asked in a text whether the estate funds were confirmed. Paige replied, they will be once Natalie signs. The timestamp mattered. At that point, no probate estate had been opened. No creditor claim had been filed. I had not been appointed executor, and no one had presented me with the funeral packet. Paige already knew there would be a settlement. She already expected my signature. Grant had access to the file because both of them were account administrators. He exported the original voice memo, app records, and message history, then delivered them through his attorney. He gave a formal statement about the wedding finances. He also admitted that he had ignored unexplained payments for months because asking questions might have forced them to reduce the wedding or delay the house purchase. I kept telling myself Paige's parents were wealthy, he said in the statement. I knew the company was under pressure. I chose not to connect those facts. It was not heroism. It was accountability, arriving late. That afternoon, Marisol told me she was ready to let me hear a portion of Daniel's final recording. The original media remained sealed inside the steel box. Investigators and Marisol had already authenticated a working copy Daniel had transmitted to her secure system. She played one continuous section without editing or rearranging the conversation. Daniel's voice entered first. The Northline certificates do not match what was delivered. Paige, you created the vendor profile. You need to report it before the lender or the state finds it. Martin interrupted, telling him the company needed time. Daniel continued, I'm not asking for a public confession tonight. Correct the vendor records, preserve the real invoices, and stop the riverfront work. I'll help explain the operating loss if Paige stops changing the files. Elaine said Daniel was being dramatic. Then Paige spoke. If I report it, I lose my job. You may lose the position, Daniel said. You don't have to lose your future. You don't understand. Dad trusts you more than me. Mom introduces Natalie like she built her life perfectly, and then explains what I'm still trying to fix. This has nothing to do with Natalie. It has everything to do with her. I tell the truth, and she is still the good daughter. You are still the honorable son Dad wishes he had. I become the failure who almost destroyed the company. Daniel's answer was quiet. You become the person who stopped before someone got hurt. Paige waited several seconds. Then she said, I can fix the timeline. Once the certificates are replaced, no one needs to know. The recording continued beyond that point, but Marisol stopped the working copy after the conversation moved to Martin's schedule order. I sat with both hands beneath the table. Paige had known the certificates were wrong. She had known Daniel rejected the connectors. He had offered to help her report the losses without turning the situation into a public spectacle. She had chosen to alter the timeline instead. Her resentment of me was real. So was the pressure from our parents. Neither had taken control of her hands at the hospital or forced her to move money through wedding vendors. The part of me that had kept searching for a smaller version of Paige's guilt finally had nothing left to protect. 3 days before Christmas, the family's attorney sent a new settlement offer. Whitaker Construction would withdraw the creditor claim in full. The company would pay the $170,000 owed under Daniel's buyback agreement, reimburse reasonable probate legal fees, and sign a statement that its review had found no evidence Daniel personally benefited from Northline. In exchange, the estate would release all fraud-related claims, keep Northline records confidential, refrain from voluntarily providing Daniel's final file to regulators, and agree not to challenge the company's description of the safety records in related proceedings. On paper, the offer gave me almost everything I had demanded at the beginning. Daniel's estate would remain intact. His name would be cleared of personal theft. The legal fees would be repaid. Probate could move toward closure. Marisol read the terms aloud and then asked what I saw. They are not buying the estate anymore, I said. No, they are buying time. And silence. The wedding money had already been spent. The false claim had been useful as leverage, but the larger objective was now obvious. If I signed, the bank trail, altered report, witness spreadsheet, and Northline records could be buried inside a private settlement. My parents could say a misunderstanding had been resolved. Paige could marry Grant. The lender could be given a cleaner explanation, and Martin could continue moving money until the next audit. The offer was not insulting. That made it dangerous. It promised money, closure, and a formal statement that Daniel had not stolen anything. It offered me the chance to win privately without learning how much public damage the truth might cause. I asked Marisol how long I had to respond. 10 days. Do not reject it yet. She studied me. I'm not accepting it, I said. I want every consequence in front of me before I decide. Leona called before the meeting ended. The laboratory had completed the comparison involving the unopened Northline box, the Tosha samples from the riverfront site, and connectors removed under controlled conditions from another Whitaker project. The heat lot markings matched. The metallurgical characteristics matched. The second project was not an empty construction site. Part of the converted textile building was already open to the public, with 2 restaurants and several shops operating beneath permanent structural connections containing bolts from the same worn lot. No new failure had been confirmed. No one had been injured there, but the safety problem Daniel died trying to expose had not ended with him. It was hanging above rooms full of people who knew nothing about Northline. The settlement offer would have given me almost everything I had asked for when the fight began. Whitaker Construction would withdraw its claim against Daniel's estate. The company would pay the $170,000 it owed under his buyback agreement, reimburse approved legal costs, and sign a formal statement that Daniel had not personally profited from Northline. Probate could move forward. My parents would stop calling my husband a thief. The estate would remain intact. In exchange, I had to release the fraud claims, keep the Northline records confidential, and agree not to challenge the company's account of the safety files in the state investigation. The agreement did not affect the workers' compensation death benefits already being handled through a separate process. It did not ask me to surrender my house, take over the company, or hand Paige a wedding check. It asked for something more valuable, my silence. Marisol placed the proposed agreement between us. You could sign this and protect your financial position, she said. That is not the same as saying you should. What happens to the other project? Tosha and the local building officials can continue without your permission. They already have some of the laboratory findings. Some? They do not yet have every original record Daniel preserved. The company would also gain time to dispute the inspection scope, move assets, and describe Northline as an isolated administrative error. The converted textile building was already partly open. Restaurants served lunch beneath exposed brick walls. Families walked through the retail corridor on weekends. Construction continued in unfinished sections separated by temporary barriers. Leona's tests did not prove another connection was about to fail. They proved that bolts from the same warned heat lot had been installed in permanent structural connections. That was enough to require inspection. The next morning, Leona joined a conference call with Tosha and the city building department. She spoke carefully, refusing to exaggerate what the laboratory had found. "The samples are consistent with the same production lot," she explained. "We have not identified a second failure. We have identified material that should not be assumed compliant without removal or additional testing." The city ordered the affected construction zone closed, while engineers mapped where the Northline shipment had been installed. The operating restaurants and shops remained open only in sections that could be separated from the area under review. No alarms sounded. No ceiling collapsed. Customers were not rushed into the street. The danger was quieter than that. People had been eating dinner beneath steel my family had lied about. I read the settlement again that night. If I signed, I could tell myself the regulators already knew enough. I could say the state would handle the buildings while I handled Daniel's estate. I could let my parents keep their company long enough to pay the workers and finish Paige's wedding. I could also spend the rest of my life wondering which document disappeared because I had agreed not to ask for it. The next day, Marisol explained what could happen if Whitaker Construction's lender decided the fraud had placed its collateral at risk. "The bank can declare a covenant default," she said. "If it believes company assets or records are being moved, it can ask a civil court to appoint a receiver. Someone who takes over the company? Temporarily. A receiver preserves assets, keeps essential operations running, and reports to the court. Can I request one? You can raise concerns through the estate's claims, but you do not own Whitaker Construction. You do not get to appoint management or decide whether the company is sold. What leverage does the estate have? The unpaid buyback note. The false creditor claim. Potential damages connected to the fraudulent account created in Daniel's name. Those make the estate a creditor and an injured party, not the company's new owner. I looked down at the settlement, so I cannot save the company. Not by writing a check and controlling the result. I wasn't planning to write one. I know. Your father is counting on you feeling responsible for everyone he placed in danger. I want you to hear the limit clearly. I did. If the company survived, it would survive through lenders, the court, a receiver, or a legitimate buyer. I would not use Daniel's estate as emergency payroll for the people who had accused him of theft. That did not mean I wanted the workers punished. It meant protecting them could not require me to finance another lie. I told Marisol not to accept the settlement. I also told her not to reject it until I had read the final letter Daniel left. The original remained sealed inside the steel box. Before delivering it, Daniel had sent Marisol an authenticated working copy, so she would know how to carry out his instructions. She had withheld it while the creditor claim and safety investigation were developing because the letter contained information that could hurt Daniel as well as help him. We met in her office 2 days before New Year's Eve. Marisol opened the secure file and turned the screen toward me. Daniel began by apologizing. Not for Northline. For something that happened 2 years earlier. Whitaker Construction had been closing out a municipal parking project when temporary bracing caused a delay. No one had been injured, and the completed structure passed its inspections. Martin pressured Daniel to sign a summary that described the problem as a scheduling conflict rather than an inaccurate installation sequence. Daniel signed it. He wrote that he had told himself the wording did not matter because the defect had been corrected. He had told himself no public agency was misled about the completed structure. He had told himself protecting the company preserved jobs. Then he watched Martin use that signature whenever Daniel challenged him. "You signed before," Martin would say. "Do not pretend you are different from the rest of us." Daniel's letter said the shame from that decision was one reason he had kept the Northline dispute from me. He believed I would see him differently. He was right. I did see him differently. I saw a man who had once chosen convenience over accuracy, and spent 2 years trying to convince himself that one compromise had not changed him. I saw the pride that made him think he could repair the damage alone. I saw how easily guilt could be used as a leash. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "I do not need you to prove I was perfect. I wasn't. I need you not to sign another false statement because you think loving me requires it." I read the line until the words blurred. Daniel had not left me instructions to worship his memory. He had left me permission to tell the complete truth. "Give the old parking summary to the investigators," I said. Marisol watched me carefully. "It may be used to challenge his credibility." "I know. It is unrelated to Northline, but defense counsel may argue it shows a history of inaccurate reporting. Then they can make that argument. We will not hide it." That decision cost me the last simple version of Daniel. It also freed me from having to defend one. Marisol transferred the letter, the older report, and the surrounding project records through the same documented process used for the other evidence. Investigators later confirmed that the parking incident had been corrected before final inspection and had no connection to Northline. Daniel's wording had been misleading, but it did not prove he created a vendor, stole money, or approved defective steel. The truth did not weaken the case. It made the distinction clearer. By the first week of January, the investigation had moved beyond one agency. TBI agents and the district attorney's office reviewed the technical evidence alongside Tosha's safety findings. Marisol and I attended a meeting where the evidence was summarized, not to let us direct the investigation but to confirm the origin of records the estate had provided. The server image showed the report versions and Elaine's witness spreadsheet. The outside information technology logs connected Daniel's laptop to the hospital network after his death. The vendor platform connected the approval to Paige's token. The bank records traced Northline money through the false consulting account and into company reserves and wedding vendors. The laboratory linked the delivered heat lot to the failed connection and the other projects. The voice memo showed Paige expected estate money before probate had opened. The creditor claim drafts showed Elaine began building the accusation the night Daniel died. The full recording captured all three of them discussing the uncertified material, the timeline, and the plan to place responsibility on Daniel. No single item carried the entire case. Together, they formed a structure much stronger than the steel my family had purchased. An agent named Reena Patel explained that prosecutors were preparing applications for search warrants, covering company servers, archived records, and specific personal devices. "The warrants will stand on the evidence already submitted," she said. "They do not depend on any public statement or confrontation. Do you need the steel box opened?" I asked. "We have an authenticated working copy of the recording and verified transfers from Miss Vega's system. The original media remains useful for evidence, but we do not need a public opening to establish probable cause. Will you arrest them at the wedding?" Agent Patel did not react to the question. "We have not discussed arrests with you. If warrants are authorized, they will be executed according to operational needs. You should not warn anyone or interfere." "I won't." She looked directly at me. "We are also not asking you to play the recording for anyone." That distinction mattered. The investigation belonged to them. What I did with my family's public lie belonged to me. Paige's wedding was scheduled for January 24th. She had not removed me from the family list, even after our meeting. Elaine explained why in an email that sounded polite enough to display in court. Whatever disagreements exist, the family should present unity for Paige. Please attend the private champagne toast at 2. The ceremony begins at 4. The toast would include immediate family, the wedding party, the officiant, and a handful of close guests. It would take place in the ballroom before the ceremony, while the tables were fully decorated, but before the reception began. Grant had not canceled the wedding. He had moved into a hotel for several nights, after giving Marisol the voice memo, then returned to the house he shared with Paige. He told his attorney he intended to ask her for a complete explanation before the ceremony. I did not know what answer she gave him. A week before the wedding, Elaine called me. "This has gone far enough," she said. "The company offered to clear Daniel's name." "No." "The company offered to say he didn't profit if I stopped challenging the records." "You always hear the worst possible meaning. I heard you promise his estate to Paige at his funeral." My mother went quiet. Then she said, "You were grieving. You heard part of a conversation. I heard Dad explain how you expected me to sign. The company was trying to survive." Daniel was trying to survive too. Elaine's voice softened. Come to the wedding. Let one day be about your sister. Martin intends to say something kind about Daniel. You do not want the family's last public memory of him to be this dispute. There it was. She wanted to use Daniel's name one more time, in front of witnesses, to convert theft into generosity. What exactly is Dad planning to say? You will hear it with everyone else. After the call, I met Marisol at her office. The steel box sat on a low cabinet behind her desk. It was dark gray, no larger than a briefcase, with Daniel's evidence seal across the lock. The original report, recording media, and letter remained inside. The investigators already have what they need, I said. Yes. If Martin says Daniel wanted his estate used for Paige's wedding, I will correct him. You can correct him without opening the box. He will call me bitter. Mom will say I misunderstood. Paige will say the finances were technical. Marisol did not disagree. I only want one continuous section, I said. No private insults. No unrelated family conversations. Only the heat lot number, the altered timeline, and the request that Daniel take responsibility. The full recording has already been authenticated. We can document any excerpt and preserve the continuous original. I do not want the agents to time anything around us. They will not. If the warrant is executed before the toast, we still go. Yes. If Dad does not mention Daniel or the estate, the box stays closed. Marisol studied me for several seconds. This is not necessary to win the legal case. I know. Then tell me why it is necessary to you. Because they invited people to watch them turn his death into a wedding gift. The investigation can punish the fraud. It cannot correct the lie in that room unless someone does. She nodded once. The decision was mine. It was not revenge performed for strangers. It was a boundary placed in front of the exact people my parents intended to deceive. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed in a dark green gown Daniel had once said made me look impossible to intimidate. At 7:15, Marisol called. The warrants had been authorized. TBI agents and local officers had entered Whitaker Construction before dawn. The preserved server image, archived storage, and listed office devices were now under official control. Warrants for the identified personal devices would be served separately according to the written plan. My parents did not yet know how much had already been taken beyond their reach. I drove to Marisol's office before we went to the venue. The steel box waited on her conference table. For months, I had thought opening it would begin the fight. The fight had already been built through logs, records, witnesses, bank transfers, and choices my family could not erase. I placed my hand on the cold metal. The investigation no longer needs the box, I said. The truth still does. The ballroom looked finished even though the wedding had not begun. Tall candles burned beneath crystal chandeliers. White flowers climbed the columns near the dance floor, and gold-placed cards waited on tables no guest had yet touched. Beyond the closed double doors, the ceremony space was still empty. The private champagne toast was scheduled for 2 o'clock, 2 hours before Paige and Grant were supposed to exchange vows. Only immediate family, the wedding party, the officiant, and a few close friends had been invited. Paige stood near the cake in her wedding dress, surrounded by women adjusting her veil and photographing her from every angle. Grant wore a black tuxedo and held the small ring box meant for the ceremony. He had not put on a wedding band because he was not married yet. Marisol sat near a side exit with the sealed steel box beside her chair. The 2 TBI agents were not inside pretending to be guests. They were waiting in the front lobby with local officers, carrying warrants that had been approved before sunrise. Their work did not depend on anything my father said during the toast. Neither did my decision. Elaine crossed the ballroom the moment she saw me. Her smile remained steady, but her fingers tightened around my arm. "You came," she said. "You invited me. I was afraid your attorney would convince you this was another legal proceeding." I looked past her at Marisol. She didn't have to convince me of anything. Mom lowered her voice. "Let one day be about Paige. Whatever disagreements exist, she should not be punished for them." I had listened to Paige describe how she could fix Daniel's timeline. I had seen the money from Northline reach her ballroom, florist, and future home. "This day is already about Paige," I said. Elaine searched my face for a promise I had not made. The wedding planner approached with a tablet pressed against her chest. "Paige, I need confirmation on the final vendor balance. Accounting says the transfer is still under review. Paige glanced at our mother. It's been handled. Grant turned toward her. Handled by whom? Mom and Dad's business office. You told the lender it was family reimbursement. It is. Grant's grip tightened around the ring box. From Daniel's estate? Several people nearby became quiet. Paige gave him a look that was meant to end the conversation. Not now. The wedding planner stepped away. Elaine took my champagne flute from a passing server and placed it in my hand. Smile, she whispered. People are watching. I set the untouched glass on a table. That was when Martin called everyone together. My father stood beneath an arch of white roses and lifted his glass. He looked rested, composed, and entirely certain that the room still belonged to him. We have all been through an extraordinary season, he began. Today is proof that family can survive loss, misunderstanding, and even painful division. His eyes found mine. Daniel was more than an employee. He was a son to us, and he loved Paige as a sister. Before he passed, he helped create a legacy that made this day possible. A murmur moved through the room. My father continued. Natalie and I have not agreed on every detail, but we agree that Daniel would want this family to move forward. I stepped away from the table. No, I said. Martin's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Every face turned toward me. I never agreed that Daniel's estate was a wedding gift. Elaine approached with her palms open. Natalie, this is not the place. Dad made it the place when he used Daniel's name. Martin's expression hardened. The company and the estate reached an understanding in principle. We did not. You rejected a settlement that would clear your husband's name and protect his co-workers. The settlement required me to support records you knew were false. Paige moved closer to Grant. Please stop, she said. You're doing this because you hate that I'm happy. I looked at her. No, I'm doing this because Daniel told you the connectors were uncertified, and you changed the report after he died. Her face went still. Martin pointed toward the door. You will not turn my daughter's wedding into a courtroom. I don't need to. I nodded to Marisol. She stood and carried the steel box to a small table near the front of the room. This box was sealed by Daniel Ross before his death, she said. It contains original records and original recording media. The full recording was preserved and authenticated before today. What you are about to hear is one continuous portion, not a rearranged collection of statements. Martin laughed once. This is outrageous. Marisol documented the condition of the seal, opened the lock, and removed the original media. The ballroom speakers gave a quiet click. Then Daniel's voice filled the room. The Heatlafahwat number on the Northline shipment is N4762. That number does not match the certificate filed with the project. My father answered on the recording. I know what the certificate says. I also know what another delay does to the credit line. Daniel's voice remained level. The material has not been verified. The riverfront work stays stopped. Paige spoke next. I can correct the timeline version. Once the proper certificates are uploaded, the file will read the way it should have read. The file should show what happened, Daniel said, not what protects you afterward. Elaine's voice entered. Daniel, take responsibility for the vendor approval. Martin can handle the safety issue, and we will make sure Natalie is protected. You want me to admit I created Northline. We want the family to survive. Daniel paused. If anything happens to me, Natalie will not have to beg anyone to believe her. She will have the record. Marisol stopped the recording. No one moved. The candles still burned, the flowers still framed the room, Paige's dress still spread across the floor like the day had not changed. Martin recovered first. That conversation is incomplete, he said. Daniel was angry. He misunderstood a temporary accounting issue. Elaine turned toward the guests. My daughter chose a wedding to humiliate grieving parents. I chose the moment you used Daniel's death as a toast, I said. Paige looked at Grant. I didn't understand the technical side. Dad and Daniel fought about projects constantly. Grant held the ring box at his waist. Did you know Daniel rejected those connectors before he died? Paige glanced at her attorney, who had entered from the lobby moments earlier. Grant, don't do this in front of everyone. It is a yes or no question. You have no idea what my family was dealing with. Did you know? She took a step toward him. We can talk privately. Grant looked at her for several seconds. He had already heard her voice memo. He knew she expected my signature before probate had even opened. What he needed was not another explanation. He needed to see whether she could tell the truth when the lie no longer protected her. Paige reached for his hand. "Please don't embarrass me." Grant closed the ring box. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. He placed it on the table in front of her. "There won't be a ceremony today." Paige stared at the box. "Grant, I asked whether you knew. You're taking her side?" "I'm taking mine." He spoke quietly with the officiant, then walked toward the side doors without looking at my parents. Paige called after him once. He did not stop. Martin moved toward Marisol and the steel box. "You will hand that over to my attorney." Marisol stepped between him and the table. "The original is being preserved according to Daniel's instructions and existing legal process. You brought stolen company information into a wedding. The investigators already possess authenticated evidence independent of this presentation." At the word investigators, Martin looked toward the entrance. Elaine caught his sleeve. "Do not leave. I'm calling crisis counsel." He pulled free and walked across the ballroom. I followed far enough to see the lobby. 2 TBI agents stood between Martin and the front doors. Local officers waited several feet behind them. Agent Patel held a folder. "Martin Whitaker?" He stopped. "We have warrants covering specified electronic devices, accounts, and company records. The Whitaker construction office is already secured. We need the phone in your possession." Martin looked back at the ballroom. "This is a family event. The warrant is not." Elaine and Paige entered the lobby behind him. Paige reached into her clutch. Agent Patel said, "Keep your hands visible until we identify the listed device." No one was handcuffed. No one was declared guilty. The officers documented each phone before placing it into an evidence bag. Martin demanded to call his lawyer. Agent Patel told him he could do so from another phone after the listed device had been surrendered. Elaine turned on me. "You planned all of this. The warrants were approved before Dad made his toast. You destroyed your sister's wedding. Paige destroyed her wedding when she chose the lie over the answer Grant asked for. You destroyed your father's company." I looked at the 3 of them standing beneath the ballroom's gold entrance sign. "I didn't destroy this family. I stopped you from burying the truth with my husband. I did not stay to watch the guests leave, or the wedding staff begin dismantling a celebration that would never happen." Marisol carried the resealed box. I walked beside her through a service corridor and out into the January air. Behind us, the ballroom remained bright. The truth did not need darkness to expose them. That evening, Leona called while I was sitting in my car outside my house. Tosha and city inspectors had completed emergency testing at the converted textile building. A permanent structural connection in the active construction zone contained bolts from the same Northline heat lot. Microscopic cracking had already begun around one bolt hole. The affected section was being restricted immediately. Adjacent connections would be tested before the area reopened. No one had been hurt. Not yet. My family had lost a wedding that afternoon. The next morning, they were about to learn whether the company they had sacrificed Daniel to protect could survive the buildings he had tried to save. The morning after Paige's wedding collapsed, the city closed the active construction zone inside the converted textile building. They did not evacuate the restaurants or send shoppers running into the street. Engineers separated the unfinished wing from the occupied section, installed temporary supports, and began removing selected connectors under controlled conditions. Leona called me before noon. "The cracking is real," she said. "It has not reached full failure, but the connection cannot remain in service. How many others are like it? We won't know until every Northline location is mapped." The first fractured bolt had been hidden behind finished material. No customer could have seen it. No restaurant owner could have known that the steel above them came from the same warned heat lot Daniel had tried to stop at the riverfront project. That was what my parents had asked me to keep confidential. They had offered to restore Daniel's estate and clear him of personal theft while defective connections remained inside another building. Had I signed, I could have told myself the regulators would eventually find them without me. Eventually had almost killed 2 more people. The inspections lasted several weeks. The building remained partially open only where independent engineers confirmed that occupied areas could be safely isolated. The unfinished wing stayed closed. Every Northline connector was cataloged, tested, replaced, or formally cleared. The second Whitaker project received the same review. No additional collapse occurred. No one else died. That outcome did not make my family's decisions less serious. It proved Daniel's warning had arrived before the next tragedy, even though he had not lived to see anyone listen. Paige's wedding disappeared almost overnight. The photographs were removed from social media. The wedding website went dark. The ballroom sent notices regarding unpaid vendor balances, cancellation costs, and storage fees for rented decorations. Elaine released a statement saying the ceremony had been postponed because of an unexpected family emergency. Grant corrected her through his attorney. The wedding had not been postponed. It had been canceled. He returned the larger gifts and surrendered the shared wedding planning records. He gave investigators access to the account where Paige and Elaine had managed payments. He also admitted that he had ignored expenses he knew their salaries could not comfortably support. Grant did not pretend he had been innocent of every choice. He said he had wanted the house, the ballroom, and the life Paige promised him. Each time a payment appeared without a clear source, he chose not to ask because the answer might force him to give something up. That was the difference between Grant and my family. He had looked away while the lie benefited him. Once the truth became unavoidable, he stopped asking other people to carry it for him. Paige never contacted him again after he moved his belongings out of their house. She contacted me once. Her message contained only 6 words. "You got what you always wanted." I did not answer. I had wanted my husband to come home from work. Everything after that had been damage control. By February, Whitaker Construction's lender had completed its first review of the seized records. The company had violated several loan agreements by hiding liabilities, shifting money through false vendor accounts, and providing financial reports that did not reflect the true cost of the riverfront project. The bank declared a default. Martin held a company meeting and told employees the decision resulted from outside pressure and a vindictive estate dispute. He said the company could recover if I released the buyback debt and withdrew the fraud claims. Several employees called Marisol to ask whether that was true. It was not. The estate's claims mattered, but they were not the reason the lender froze Martin's access. The bank had discovered that Whitaker Construction could no longer prove where project money had gone or whether its collateral was worth what Martin claimed. The insurer issued a reservation of rights letter. It had not yet refused every form of coverage, but it warned that falsified safety and financial records could limit what the policy would pay. The lender and insurer then asked a civil court to appoint a temporary receiver. I attended the hearing beside Marisol. Martin sat across the aisle with 3 attorneys. Elaine sat behind him in a cream coat, looking offended that the courthouse did not recognize her social standing. Paige did not appear. The receiver's attorney explained that Whitaker Construction still had viable contracts, equipment, trained employees, and work that could be completed safely. It also had unreliable books, disputed accounts, frozen credit, and management accused of altering records after an employee's death. The judge did not award the company to me. He did not let the estate appoint executives or control payroll. He placed the business under an independent receiver, whose responsibility was to preserve assets, secure records, pay essential expenses when possible, and determine whether the viable operations could be sold. Martin lost access to the company's primary accounts that afternoon. Paige's controller permissions were terminated. Elaine was barred from contacting employees about the investigation or removing files from the office. My father stopped beside me outside the courtroom. "You got what you wanted," he said. "I wanted Daniel alive. You know what I mean. I know what you need to believe." His face tightened. "You could still save this company." "How?" "Release the buyback claim. Delay the fraud case. Give the receiver room to operate." "The receiver already has room to operate." "You are taking money away from payroll." "No, you moved payroll money through a vendor you used to frame my husband." Martin leaned closer. "If this company dies, that will be on you." It was the same weapon he had used from the beginning. Employees. Insurance. Mortgages. Children. Every person, depending on Whitaker Construction, became a weight he placed in my arms whenever he wanted me to surrender. I handed the weight back. "The employees are now under someone who has to report to the court. They are safer from me than they ever were from you." I walked away before he could answer. The estate had a legitimate position in the receivership. Whitaker Construction owed Daniel $170,000 under the buyback agreement. The estate also had claims arising from the false creditor filing, the account created in Daniel's name, and the legal expenses required to expose those acts. That made us a creditor and an injured party. It did not make me the owner. The receiver eventually recommended selling the functioning operations to a regional contractor with enough capital to complete the safe projects and remediate the North Line sites. The buyer wanted Whitaker Construction's equipment, workforce, selected contracts, and warehouse. It did not want the Whitaker name. It also refused to retain Martin, Elaine, or Paige in any ownership, management, consulting, or financial role. Marisol asked which sale terms the estate should support. Keep payroll current where possible, I said. Require a complete Northline audit. Preserve every record the investigators need. No confidentiality clause that limits Daniel's estate. No hidden ownership for my parents or Paige. We can request those protections, she reminded me. The receiver and the court make the final decision. I understand. I did not demand that the company be destroyed so I could collect money faster. I also did not forgive its debt, finance operations, or guarantee a loan. The estate agreed not to pursue immediate seizure of certain operating assets while the sale was pending. In return, the proposed order preserved the estate's claims, protected relevant records, and required the buyer to complete the safety remediation. Most qualified employees were offered continued work. Caleb remained, though he accepted a demotion that removed him from unsupervised safety decisions. He told me he had spent months replaying the moment Martin ordered a limited crew back into the restricted area. I should have refused, he said. Yes, I kept thinking fear made it less of a choice. It explains the choice. It doesn't erase it. He nodded. That was all either of us needed to say. April remained in inventory accounting under a new finance director. Her son was allowed to reapply for the apprenticeship through an independent process rather than through a favor from my family. Luis returned to his original statement and completed his interview with Tosha. He admitted that Elaine's message about his brother's job and his parents' insurance had frightened him into saying he could not remember Daniel's order. No one called him a hero. He told the truth after failing to tell it sooner. Sometimes that was the most honest ending available. The sale was approved in late spring. I stood across the street when workers removed the metal letters from the front of the Whitaker construction office. Martin had spent decades building that name into a symbol of authority. He had risked lives, altered records, and accused Daniel of theft to preserve it. The operating business survived. The name did not. The new contractor replaced the safety reporting system, required independent verification for new vendors, and created a stop-work procedure no executive could quietly reverse. The riverfront warehouse remained closed until the failed section was rebuilt and certified. The textile project reopened completely after every questionable connection was replaced or cleared. The criminal investigation moved more slowly than the receivership. That frustrated people who expected the agents at the wedding to produce convictions before the flowers wilted. Warrants began a case. They did not finish one. Investigators reviewed thousands of files, interviewed employees, traced bank transfers, compared server versions, and separated bad business decisions from conduct that could support criminal charges. Martin denied wrongdoing through most of the summer. His attorneys claimed he relied on finance staff for vendor compliance and believed the connector issue was temporary. They argued that he never intended for anyone to be injured. No one accused him of planning Daniel's death. The case against him was that he knew the material could not be verified, ordered work to continue, supported false records after the collapse, and tried to place the consequences on Daniel's estate. His email made the first point difficult to deny. The recording made the second worse. The altered report and creditor claim completed the pattern. In August, Martin entered a guilty plea involving falsified records, obstruction, and willful safety violations. Sentencing occurred later, after the court reviewed the financial harm, Daniel's death, and Martin's attempts to mislead investigators. The licensing board conducted its own proceeding. Martin's contractor license was revoked. That loss wounded him more deeply than the criminal judgment. For years, he had introduced himself as the man who built Whitaker Construction from one truck. Without the license and without the company name, he could no longer recreate his authority somewhere else and call the collapse a family misunderstanding. Elaine continued insisting she had only tried to protect frightened employees. Her defense weakened each time another record was authenticated. The first creditor claim draft had been created the night Daniel died. The spreadsheet tracked employees' health insurance, pensions, relatives, and vulnerabilities. The earlier version of the column, titled Stability Concern, had been titled Leverage. Her voicemail to Luis showed how she used concern as a delivery system for fear. In September, Elaine entered a plea connected to the false claim, obstruction, and unlawful witness pressure. Her attorneys submitted letters describing her charity work, church service, and reputation for helping families. The prosecutor answered with the timeline. At 11:48 on the night Daniel died, while I was still trying to understand that my husband would never leave the hospital, Elaine had started drafting the accusation that would make his estate available to Paige. By then, the family house was being prepared for sale. Martin's guarantees, restitution obligations, legal fees, and the company's debt had consumed the equity my parents once treated as untouchable. The cabin was sold next. Elaine asked through her attorney whether she could stay in my guest room while she found something appropriate. I told Marisol to send her a list of extended stay hotels, short-term rentals, and housing services available through her legal team. I did not leave my mother without options. I also did not invite her into my home so she could turn dependence into another claim on my life. Paige resolved her case before Elaine did. The old address connected her to Northline. Controller records connected her permissions to the vendor. The hospital network, Daniel's laptop, and her authentication token connected her to the altered report after his death. The wedding accounts connected her to the money. Her attorneys argued that Martin's pressure and Elaine's expectations shaped her decisions. I did not dispute that. Pressure explained why telling the truth felt costly. It did not make her fingers move by themselves. Paige pleaded guilty to unauthorized computer access, falsification of records, and a fraud-related charge. She lost her controller position and was barred for a set period from work involving control over fiduciary funds. Restitution required her to sell her vehicle, jewelry, and her interest in the condominium she had planned to furnish after the wedding. During her statement to the court, Paige admitted Daniel had not created Northline, had not approved the false consulting account, and had not personally received the money routed through it. She did not look at me. She did not need to. Her admission entered the official record. The estate case remained open through the autumn. Workers' compensation death benefits were handled separately because Daniel had died during the course of his employment. Those benefits were not part of probate and were not described as payment for his life. Probate dealt with his will, valid debts, the buyback agreement, the false creditor claim, administration costs, and restitution connected to the fraudulent account. 14 months after Daniel's death, the court formally disallowed Whitaker Construction's claim against his estate. The estate received the unpaid buyback amount, approved reimbursement, and restitution ordered through the related proceedings. The final TOSHA findings arrived the same week. Daniel had issued an internal stop work notice. The connectors delivered through Northline did not match the compliance certification placed in the company file. The approved report was not the version Daniel created. The connector failure contributed to the riverfront collapse. The findings also addressed the old parking project summary Daniel had signed 2 years earlier. I had insisted that Marisol provide it with the rest of his records. Investigators concluded that the wording had been misleading, but that the installation issue had been corrected before final inspection. It had no connection to Northline, did not establish that Daniel created the vendor, and did not make the altered riverfront approval genuine. Daniel was not declared flawless. He was declared innocent of the theft and deception my family assigned to him. That was the truth I wanted. Not sainthood. Not a polished memory. The truth. Paige's letter arrived 3 days later. She did not ask for money. She did not blame Martin or Elaine. She wrote that Daniel had given her a chance to report Northline before anyone was injured. She admitted she had known the certificates were wrong. She admitted she had known the settlement required my signature before probate even opened. She admitted that when forced to choose between the truth and the future she had planned, she chose herself. At the end, she wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed to stop pretending I didn't know." I read the letter twice and placed it in my desk. I did not answer. Forgiveness was not a reward someone earned by finally admitting what the evidence had already proven. It was not a deadline imposed on me because Paige had reached the stage of her punishment where regret became useful. Perhaps one day I would respond. That day had not arrived. The following afternoon, I drove past the restored riverfront warehouse. The damaged frame had been rebuilt. Workers moved behind marked safety barriers. The new company's sign stood above the entrance. Daniel's name was not displayed anywhere. It did not need to be. The official record carried what mattered. At home, I removed the steel box from the closet and set it on the kitchen table. I placed Daniel's ring inside beside the probate order and the final safety findings. I added his letter to me, including the page where he admitted the old report he should never have signed. I left Paige's letter outside. The truth about Daniel had been settled. My relationship with my sister had not. For most of my life, my family taught me that love meant absorbing damage so everyone else could preserve what they wanted. They called silence loyalty. They called surrender peace. They called the business a legacy, even when saving it required a dead man's name. I did not recover the family I thought I had. I recovered my right to define what family was allowed to ask of me. I could care that workers kept their jobs without financing my father. I could refuse to let my mother become homeless without opening my home to her. I could acknowledge the pressure Paige lived under without excusing what she chose. I could love Daniel without lying about his flaws. That was the difference between mercy and self-erasure. Mercy recognized another person's humanity. Self-erasure demanded that I deny my own. I closed the steel box and rested my hand on the lid. Daniel had left it because he feared no one would believe him while my family controlled the records. By the time I closed it for the last time, belief was no longer the issue. The records had spoken. The buildings had been repaired. The claim had been erased. His name had been restored. Everything my parents tried to preserve through lies had either changed hands or disappeared. Everything Daniel tried to protect through the truth was still standing. When your family asks you to protect them by signing away your rights, hiding evidence, or carrying consequences they created, stop and verify facts. Grief, guilt, and loyalty make pressure sound like love, but real love never requires you to support a lie. Keep copies, consult professionals, protect your finances, and let legal processes handle wrongdoing. You can show compassion without funding, manipulation, offering shelter, or sacrificing your future. You do not need a perfect victim to defend the truth. If this story reminded you to choose boundaries over silence, subscribe to the channel for stories of courage and justice.